So we've got exciting dread mobs and speed freaks, bully boys and the return of the green tide. Grab your slugger and chopper because it's time for a full review of 10th edition Codex Orks. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the greenskins. In this video I thought we'd do a full overview of their Codex for 10th edition, talk through all those shiny and really quite destructive new detachments, and all the datasheet changes that happen to be in this book. Overall, from first impressions, it does look kind of fun. Orks have always been one of those armies that have quite a few fun archetypes, things like Dread Mob, Speed Freaks, and now Beast Snaggers and things, but they've often tended to just play in one particular way, and I feel like this 10th edition detachment system might be a better chance than most of making different sub-armies actually work. Hopefully Games Workshop managed to make them suitably strong, competitive and destructive on the tabletop, though I do feel like the rules here are kind of fun, even if they don't manage that consistently throughout 10th. In Codex Orks, we have all the normal things that we'd normally have for a Warhammer 40k Codex. Elsewhere in the book, we have the lore and miniature galleries, a good section on Crusade content, getting some stomping points as you go about making your Waaghs, and there's combat patrol rules for the new Ork Combat Patrol box set, the one with the Squighog Boys and Beast Boss. For the purposes of this video, I will be focusing on the Orks main rules. As ever, we've got the standard faction rule, which is Waaagh and remains broadly unchanged. 6 different detachments, including some really quite fun and interesting ones. We've got Dread Mob, Bully Boys, Kult of Speed, Da Big Hunt, and Green Tide, all in addition to the new rebranded War Horde, which essentially is just the index detachment reskinned, so if you like that, then it's still basically there. Orks are really quite a big and chunky army. They've got 51 datasheets in this codex. There is a new datasheet for the new model for the Big Mek that launches alongside the book. Though unfortunately there have been some big datasheet hits, as with several codexes in 10th edition, 7 datasheets have been lost, many of them resin finecast characters, and sadly quite fun ones as well. And there's been a couple that have been shifted and consolidated, the custom force field mech replaced by the new Big Mek, and the knob on Smasher Squig now just runs alongside the Squighog Boys, as he probably should have done from the start. There are plenty of datasheet changes as well. Most things aren't absolutely earth-shattering or groundbreaking stuff, though there's been lots of subtle tweaks, some buffs and some nerfs. In general, I feel like the main changes to the codex though really come from the detachments, which really give things like the Buggies, Beast Snaggers, and Orky Walkers significantly different ways to play. I think that's going to add the bulk of the excitement versus the datasheet changes. As ever with these 10th edition codexes, the points section is redundant, which I will spell out later as well. Games Workshop will release the official points as a digital download, though it can still be useful enough to talk about a few of the points costs as we go along. For new units like the new Big Mek and the enhancements, they're the best guide that we have to go on as of yet. Overall, plenty of fun stuff, so let's jump straight in. First up, the army rule is Waaagh. This remains unchanged. Not the worst decision in my mind. I feel like it's a pretty powerful and effective rule. Basically, at the start of one battle round, you get to deliver a great Waaagh cry, and then the Orks just go into absolute rage mode for the entirety of that battle round. For both your turn and your opponent's turn, you'll all get a 5+ invulnerable save, +1 strength and +1 attack in close combat, which is a massive damage boost, and also advance and charge. So basically the Orks are tougher, faster and stronger. It is being a rule that maybe helps out melee Orks more so than ranged ones. Generally it might make sense to usually call it either turn 2 or turn 3. Often turn 1 you won't be able to get enough units into melee unless the opponent's really running at you. And generally you don't want to call it too late, given that you want to have a big swing in the game earlier rather than later. Calling it at the start of a battle round can potentially have some negatives. It means that your opponent will see it coming if they happen to be going first. If you call the Waaagh, then they know that they're going to be expecting big melee next turn, so might position their units accordingly, maybe trying to limit the impact, even with your advance and charge. It does mean though, if you had lots of units out in the open and were just about to take some big damage, then you could call it to try and get those invulnerable saves and tank a bit of enemy damage, so it's not all bad. Overall, solid faction rule definitely has a massive impact, and does keep melee as generally a very important part of any Orky army list, even ones that might be a little bit more ranged focused. Moving on to the detachments, and as mentioned we have 6 of them. As per the other detachments in 10th edition, none of them lock out any models. You can field literally any Orky army in any of these detachments, but in general it just doesn't make sense to, given that basically all the supporting rules might be dedicated to one aspect of the army. Each of them get the fairly standard 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems for each one, plus a core detachment rule, trading out that sustained hits one that you get from the index detachment, now called the War Horde. Running through the overall themes quickly, the War Horde gives you generalist melee with a few stratagems that can help various different aspects of the army. Feels kind of goths and might makes right. The Big Hunt is the Beast Snagger one, nominating one prey target and then getting big damage boost against that. The Kult of Speed supports the Speed Freaks, Boyz Bikes and Deffkoptas are the order of the day here. They go even faster, can fall back and shoot, and get some rather nasty damage and defensive stratagems. The Dread Mob is a seriously fun one for Ork Walkers and also helps anything led by a Big Mek as well. Plus gives you Grot's battle line and a little bit more support for Gretchen, and a lot of mechanics revolving around whether or not you choose to risk some hazardous tests to push your walkers to the limit. Green Tide is Horde Orks, basically everything entirely focusing around the Boyz datasheet. You're probably going to want 120 of them if you're playing this. And finally, Bully Boyz is Knobs and Mega Knobs focused, getting 2 turns of Waaagh for these units, plus some fairly nice damage and defensive boosts, and multiple turns of Waaagh just in itself is pretty savage, particularly on the Orky elites. Overall, I think it's a genuinely interesting selection. Pretty much all of them, I think, have some sort of competitive edge to them. For competitive play, I feel like the Beast Snagger one might be the most niche, given that the core rule is just a little bit unreliable, though it definitely still has some pretty interesting features beyond that. Seeing as we're on that, shall we start with the Big Hunt? As mentioned, this one's the Beast Snagger detachment, and true to form, their special rule is all about laying low the biggest and scariest thing in the enemy army. A focused Orky damage buff where you get to pick one monster, vehicle, or warlord keyword unit in the command phase for the opponent's army, and then it's both easier to get into combat with that, plus you get extra AP when you get there. I feel like against the right army that is going to be really powerful. If you're playing say against Imperial or Chaos Knights, you're going to be spoilt for choice, just literally choose your favourite units to lay low each turn. And I do like that against things that don't just have vehicle heavy armies, you still have the option to nominate a warlord unit. It means maybe if you were playing against a faction that had an aggressive infantry warlord, then you could potentially go after them. Say for example Adeptus Custodes, where perhaps their characters might be leading from the front. In addition, if the warlord's not on the battlefield, or at least on a transport in the battlefield, if it's either in reserve or has been slain, you can nominate a different regular character to hunt instead, and that could open you up a few more options depending on what the opponent's doing with their warlord and whether or not you've killed it. For the buffs against your prey target, you get to reroll charges with Beast Snagger units against it, so it could save some command points there and gives them a small boost to getting into combat. And then for the fun damage enhancement, you get to get bonus AP against that prey unit both at range and in melee, again with Beast Snagger keyword units. In general, Beast Snagger range doesn't tend to be all that exciting. You might get a few extra sticker shots, I suppose, but their melee really is quite considerable. This one feels kind of excellent for things like Squighog Boys, which might well be throwing out quite a lot of wounds with their anti-keywords, but they don't actually have the highest AP in the world, and this will genuinely help them out quite a lot against big tanky 2+ saves. Overall, I do feel like it's a fun rule, but at base maybe not super strong against the entire field. You might be playing against armies that are mostly infantry and have their warlord hidden somewhere safe. Against that sort of force, you're basically going to be playing without a detachment rule, though you're definitely going to be helped out against anything that is monster or vehicle heavy, and plenty of armies in 40k do choose to run so. Overall not awful, certainly good in the right matchup. As a core rule, I'm not sure it outweighs the Warhorde sustained hits on everything in melee though. Moving on to the stratagems, and absolutely all of these are locked to Beast Snaggers only. First for 1 CP we've got Unstoppable Momentum. This one's triggered when a mounted Beast Snagger unit charges an enemy. You get to inflict a mortal wound on a 4+ per mounted model when you've charged in. They don't all have to make it into an engagement range, which is probably best, given that the bases are quite big on the Squighogs. You get to roll an extra 3d6 if you're charging your prey, and it's capped out at a 6 mortal wound max. I feel like maybe this is one to go for when you're charging in with an absolutely maxed out Squighog unit. You can have up to 9 in the unit with the Squigosaur now. Potentially if you were charging your prey targets, then that'd give you a pretty reasonable chance of maxing the 6 mortal wound cap, which is nice. Though I do kind of feel like if you're charging in with quite that much greenskin might, there's a good chance that you get to kill most normal sized targets anyway. Maybe want to use opportunistically for a small squad targeting the prey, or an all-in-one for your alpha unit trying to take down the enemy's strongest thing. 4 or 5 mortal wounds could be pretty devastating if it is a target that your Beast Snaggers are actually going to struggle with. For 1 CP there's Drag It Down, which is a battle tactic. This one gives Beast Snaggers sustained hits 1 in melee, or also grants critical hits on a 5+ if they're targeting their prey. Even if it's not into a prey unit, it's honestly not the worst. Sustained hits is usually a 25% damage increase if you're hitting on a 3+. Seems like a very easy use if you are targeting the prey though, where you get the better AP as well. In the situations when you can also get lethal hits as well, such as Ghazghkull and the Waaagh, or if you get lucky with a kill rig, then that could potentially give you sustained and lethal hits on a 5+. For 1 CP, there's that one's even bigger. This one's an entirely prey focused one where you get to either advance and charge or fall back and charge, provided you actually charge your prey targets as at least one of the nominated charge targets. I feel like that's situationally handy. I guess it means that in your right circumstances, your choice of prey target could effectively give your unit advance and charge, even in a turn where you're not in the war. Again, one that's kind of useful if you do have a prey target that's towards the front of your opponent's army, not useful if there's nothing in range. Next, for 1 command point, we've got Where Do You Think You're Going? This one's kind of like a reactive move when the enemy falls back from a beast snagger unit. It does have to be an infantry or mounted one though, so no kill rigs for this one. Your unit then gets to normal move 6 inches. It could mean that you just pursue the enemy unit wherever they're going, though you won't be able to wind up in combat with them again. Though to be honest, I feel like it might be more disruptive to just hop your beast snaggers to the wrong side of a ruined wall so the enemy can't shoot them, stay safe for a turn, and then go in for another big charge in the next turn. For 1 command point, we've got Stalking Tactics. This one gives you cover for an infantry or mounted unit, and also stealth for infantry. Again, locks to beast snagger only, as they all are. Maybe could be alright for squig hogs out in the open with their 4+ saves going to a 3. I guess potentially alright if you've got beast snagger boys out in the open and they're being targeted by something that really doesn't want the -1 to hit. Maybe a little bit situational. And finally, for 1 CP, we've got Instinctive Hunters. This one's a useful return to strategic reserve special rule at the end of the enemy fight phase for any unit that's not in engagement range. Again, any beast snagger unit, though this one could be used on things like kill rigs or hunter rigs if you wanted to go all in. Generally, these ones are pretty handy to have, means that you could have a beast snagger boy unit reposition and go and threaten the enemy home field if there's enough of a gap for them, or just do a bit of redeploying and pressing the attack. If your unit happens to be out of position, you should at least be able to guarantee a 9-inch charge on one enemy unit with this stratagem. Potentially that could be an 8-inch charge if you had a Squigosaur boss leading a unit of squig hogs. Overall, I feel like the stratagems are broadly useful. Maybe most of them aren't so enormously standout, they're truly game changing. I don't feel like there's any of them that are just complete duds though. Multiple different ways of extra damage, nice reactive movements and return to reserve shenanigans, and advance and charge could be really nice to have, although you would have to think about what you nominate for your prey. Finally, for the beast snagger detachment, we've got the enhancements. Proper Killie is 15 points for +1 damage to melee weapons. This one seems like an easy enough pickup for that cost, I think. Getting the bosses from damage 2 to damage 3 is kind of enormous, particularly on the standard beast boss with his 4+ devastating wounds on the charge. That seems like a pretty brutal way to take down enemy tanks and monsters. Glory Hog, I think, is a gloriously named enhancement. That one's 30 points for a Squigosaur boss, and it allows them to get Scout 9 inches. So again, that could be potentially the Squig boss plus 8 Squig Hog boys scouting up the board. A pretty ludicrously dangerous threat to be putting in the mid-board and then threaten a whole load of charge might on the front ranks of your opponent's army, maybe even turn 1. Quite a big investment, though it does seem fun. You might want to combine it with some infiltrating commandos to make sure that the unit isn't hemmed back by the enemy scouts or infiltrators. Next up, there's Scrag Every Stash for 25 points. This one's essentially the sticky objectives type rule. Control an objective at the end of the command phase, and it remains under your control until enemy units can control it at the start or end of any turn. Seems handy enough, but maybe not stand out for 25 points. You could just take along one unit of regular boys to get the rule in your army if you really want it. As your standard issue boys get that as their special rule now, it will be breaking the theme of beast snaggers just a tiny bit, I suppose. Finally, for 20 points, we've got Surly as a Squigoth. That one's again locked to the Squigosaur boss, and it's a -1 to wound for their unit against any attacks that are greater strength than their toughness, both range and melee. With Squig Hogs at toughness 7, that is going to come up, and it is going to be well worth firing anti-tank weapons at them. Just to have that permanently active on a really big scary unit, I think is going to be pretty great. If you are bringing a Squigosaur boss with a big unit, then it will be a debate between that and the Scout one, I suppose. Both of them do seem really quite powerful. I guess no reason that you couldn't have both in an army if you're going for 2 enormous units of squigs. Overall, I do think there's a bunch of fun stuff in the detachment. There is a fair bit of pretty good stuff for supporting things like squig hogs and beast snagger boys jumping out of kill rigs charging into the enemy. I feel like most of the strategy options maybe feel like fairly costed as opposed to standout, and maybe the same with the enhancements as well. I guess my main worry with the detachment is that detachment rule, it just being really good against certain enemies, but kind of whatever against others. It definitely looks playable, though I feel like it's sort of reliant on certain datasheets, particularly Squighog Boyz being strong enough to carry the main damage dealing of the army. So depending on whether they wind up particularly strong or weak after points cost would be a big deal for this. Next up, let's move on from Savage Orks to Mek Orks, and this formation is the Dread Mob, and honestly I feel like this could be one of the most fun and potentially genuinely strong detachments out of the Codex. Quite nice to see Games Workshop being brave and handing out some really quite powerful rules for the detachment. It would be really nice to see Orky Walkers good again. They certainly haven't been all that strong at the start of 10th edition. The core rule for this one is called Try Dat Button. Certainly feels like it's harking back to the Don't Press Dat special rule from the looted wagon in the past. And this rule applies to Mek keyword, Ork Walker and Grot's vehicle units. It does seem that all the big mechs and the mini mech get the Mek keyword now, so this rule will apply to anything that they're leading, and they can lead things like knobs, mega knobs, looters, boys or big guns, though the big guns will get it anyway due to being Grot vehicles. Could be fun for some Forge World datasheets as well, things like the Grot tanks or the Mecha Dread. The core rule for this one is just fun. You get one of 3 random, fairly dangerous damage boosts every time you make an attack, whether it's shooting or fighting. Either sustained hits 1, lethal hits, or better AP by 2 on a critical wound. I do think it might make some of the damage profiles for a lot of orky things just a bit of a pain to resolve though, if you're doing this literally every time most of the units in your army attack. For anything that's hitting on a 5+ at range in particular, both sustained and lethal hits are just spectacular damage boosts. Half of all of your hits are going to be critical hits, so they're going to be super meaningful. Just the sustained hits adds 50% to your damage output, which is big. It's still certainly going to be meaningful in melee as well, as a lot of orky things just tend to have better melee profiles in the first place. Otherwise, if you want a little bit more reliability, or it's just critical that you get one of these on one given turn, you do have the option to select your buff of choice, either getting sustained lethal or the extra AP thing, though it does come at the price of all your weapons becoming hazardous, and it could mean that a few small arm bolt-on things like big shooters probably do about more damage to you than your opponent, so I feel like it would be a fun rule that's worth using some of the time but not all the time. I feel like there's going to be a lot of fun in just embracing the random with this one. Just to make sure that things are extra hazardous as well, if your weapon already had hazardous through one of the stratagems or the detachment rule, then it means that you take hazardous tests that fail on a 1 or 2, so a big and very easy way to wipe out a third of your unit or take a bunch of 3 mortal wounds on your big tough vehicles. Definitely could be a move that could lead you just wiping out your entire unit just in one go there. Though the potential damage combos it can lead to are kind of brutal with the combination of the stratagems and this. Overall it looks fun and destructive, and I'm sure people will enjoy it. It does genuinely look like it's going to be enough to make orky vehicles worth fearing as well. In addition, for the detachment, you also gain Gretchen as battle line, which I wasn't really expecting. I guess the mechs like their hangers-on and support. Most army lists seem to think that around about maybe 2 units of Gretchen tend to be the sweet spot, getting a bit of command point farming but not detracting too much from your damage. I can't help but think it'd be kind of silly and fun though to put just 120 Gretchen on the board plus their attendant runt herds for another 12 models, or that's less than 500 points. Let them just be annoying chaff on the objectives and score your points all game, and then invest all the rest in big damage dealing walkers to hurt the enemy good and hard. A lot of the stratagems are really quite fun in this detachment. First up, for 1 CP we've got bigger shells for bigger gits. This one's a battle tactic for anti-tank weapons for your units. You use it in the shooting phase, and it affects the same things that the detachment rule triggers. Your unit shooting gets a +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles, and if you choose to push it, you also get hazardous for your weapons and +1 damage to all of them as well. Feels like that could be quite nice on maybe a Morkanaut shooting, where it really wants to be taking down the big tough enemy things, or pretty good with things like rockets. I noticed that the damage to pushing it thing isn't even locked to shooting against vehicles as well. So if you're willing to embrace the hazardous, you could have things like that 30-shot Gorkanaut shooter getting damage 2 on it, potentially with a nice extra buff like lethal hits, sustained hits, or extra AP. This one seems rather good. For 1 CP we've got Clanking Claws. This one's a melee damage boost. An Ork Walker gets +2 to its strength characteristic, which occasionally could be big if it makes the difference between wounding on a 5 or a 4. If you push it, then you also get +1 damage as well. I guess you're less likely to take obscene amounts of hazardous checks in close combat, which is good. Death Dreads went up to strength 12, so this could make them strength 14 to wound tough things like knights on 3s, and damage 4 definitely could be relevant against the right opponents. 4 wound infantry and bikes do exist, as well as helping you out against anything with multi-wounds. For 1 CP, there's Super Fueled Boiler, an Ork Walker in the movement phase rerolls advanced rolls and ranged weapons gain the assault keyword. This seems like it could be interesting on one of your Titanic Walkers just barreling down towards the foe in the Waaagh. Ideally, if you had a Gorkanaut or a Stomper, you might want it to advance so it can charge something in the Waaagh, and this could be a path to allow it to fire off all of its serious guns as well while it does so, with the detachment keyword to back it up. I quite like the way it also ensures you a little bit against a low advance roll as well. Probably want to mainly go with Titanic units, could certainly be interesting enough on cans or dreads as well. Perhaps one of the most terrifying stratagems is Daka Daka Daka, or very appropriate an Orky there. An Ork Walker or Grot's vehicle gets to reroll hit rolls of 1, but if you push it to take those hazardous checks, then it trades out to full rerolls to hit, though you do gain hazardous. This one feels like a seriously destructive stratagem. It feels kind of huge on a Gorkanaut or Stomper, where particularly for the primary weapons it's going to be well worth the hazardous tests, even if you might be doing them on a 1 or 2. This would mean that you're hitting with more things than you don't hit with, so that's about 5 out of 9 attacks hit, and then half of those are likely to be triggering either sustained or lethal hits, either buying it in with the detachment rule and gaining more hazardous things, or just rolling it randomly. I feel like the existence of this stratagem plus the detachment rule might genuinely be enough for people to fear the shooting of Orky Walkers, even if it hits on a 5+. For 1 CP, there's a Gretchen one in Conniving Runts. This one's a reactive move for a Gretchen unit. The opponent moves within 9 inches of them. They get to reactive move a normal move, so usually 6 inches for the Grots there. And as a bonus, unlike most reactive moves, you also get to have the chance to inflict some damage, a 4+ chance for D3+1 mortal wounds on the enemy that they're running away from. It seems the Grots are pretty adept at laying some sneaky traps. Reactive moves are generally pretty helpful to have, though they're a bit bigger on things that actually pose a bit more threat. Could still be pretty annoying for an opposing army wanting to destroy your chaff unit though. Potentially you can back up from a charge so they don't die this turn or hide behind terrain, then just jump up to be annoying and do Gretchen things in the next turn. Maybe buying you one more turn of screening if you want it. Bear in mind this doesn't work on killer cans, they've got the Grots keyword but don't have the Gretchen keyword. Finally, for 1 CP, there's Extra Gobbins. This one's a battle tactic that you nominate a non-Titanic Orky Walker or Grot's vehicle for, and it just gets -1 damage. Against the right kind of firepower, that's really big. Anything that's damage 2 or damage 3 will really feel that. Looks good for either Death Dreads or Killer Cans. I guess it could apply to the Forge World Mecha Dreads as well. That could be really quite a big serious target to be able to add that durability boost to if you wanted it. Overall, all around, I'd say that these stratagems are pretty amazing. Between Daka 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 and bigger shells for bigger gits, you've got some ludicrous stratagems to make the already good shooting in this detachment even better. A potentially useful fight phase one, a good advanced one that's really good in the turn of the Waaagh for a big super walker, and the Gretchen 1 and -1 damage both seem at least usable. I can see why you'd want some Gretchen in this detachment to farm up a few more command points. I feel like ploughing most of the command points into the Daka 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 and the bigger shells one seems like a really good way to go. Then finally for the Dread Mob we've got the enhancements, all of these are mech only. First up we've got the Smoky Goblins at 15 points, the unit gets the stealth keyword. I guess nice enough if you want to shore up a little bit of durability on something like looters or mech guns perhaps. It could be a way to get you some slightly unusually tanky boys or mega knobs at range as well. Mega knobs seem like they'd be quite durable with this, with the custom force field mech, and also the feel no pain they can now get in the Waaagh. Next up we've got the indecisively invented super glowy thing. This one's 20 points, and you select one enemy unit within 18 inches and visible to the bearer. On a 1 or 2 they test battle shock, on a 3 or 4 they take D3 mortal wounds, and on a 5 or 6 they're -1 to hit until your next command phase. It's suitably chaotic as a points filler. I'll probably put this one more in the fun category as opposed to being reliably useful though. Probably the most exciting one is Press It Faster for 35 points. This allows your mech-led units to roll an additional dice whenever you shoot using the detachment rule, gaining one additional effect on the table if it happens to be different to the one that you've already rolled or picked. It is very expensive at 35 points, but it does seem great for any mech-led ranged unit. It means you've got a 2/3 chance of getting 2 of those damage buffs, and you could layer on something like the Beggar Shell stratagem as well to hit things even harder. Finally, if you want a mech-led unit to be better at shooting but not spend 35 points for it, the Git Finder goggles genuinely seem like a very good deal for 10 points. It just ignores cover on the Meks unit, and that feels like it could be really good for a mech with a shock attack gun with some looters. Ignores cover makes the AP -1 of looters just so much more useful. I feel like they, maybe more than just about anything, are a unit that appreciates literally every one of those random boosts, and also have a particularly good chance to trigger them given that they could be re-rolling all the hit rolls when they take aim at something or an objective. It does feel like this could be the detachment that genuinely makes looters pretty good. Overall, at first impressions, I do absolutely love this detachment. The rules seem far enough that I might try and add a couple of walkers to my Orky army to try it out potentially. The detachment rules really fun and genuinely impactful. Two of the stratagems seem just absolutely murderous on top of that. And all in all, this does seem to be what the Orks needed if they really wanted to make their Daka armies work. Generally seems great, and I'm sure it'll lead to a few fun moments with the Orks just deciding to randomly blow themselves up occasionally with hazardous rolls as opposed to deal the damage they're supposed to, and that does feel very appropriate and the way it should be. Moving on from Mech Orks to Horde Orks, I was quite pleased to see the Green Tidemaker return. It's definitely one of the Orky archetypes out there. Just take a whole load of Boyz and drown the enemies under waves of bodies. The core rule is a durability one called Mob Mentality. This one applies specifically to Boyz units. It does seem that it doesn't apply to Beastnagger Boyz, just literally the standard Boyz datasheet. And they get a 5+ invulnerable save, and they get to reroll saving throws of 1, provided their unit contains 10 or more models. Overall, that really is quite a strong durability boost. A 5+ invulnerable save really helps them out against anything that's got even a little bit of AP, though besides the small reroll thing it won't really do much against anything that's AP 0. I think a durability rule is a pretty good one though. Durability is often the most important thing that you need to have a successful horde, given that any one unit needs to hold its own or its own part of the battlefield, as you might not have all that much damage, and it can just add to the overall stat check of can you kill this many orcs. I feel like it's going to be great against some things, and it's pretty awesome every time you just save an orc's life that would have died to a las cannon, though as mentioned it won't be good against some of the most efficient infantry killing guns with AP 0, and it won't even be relevant if you had cover against AP-1 attacks at range. The invulnerable save does only go so far. The reroll ones thing is okay, though I wouldn't overestimate it. The majority of times when you roll that one, you are just going to reroll it into another fail. If you were saving on that 5+ invulnerable save, it essentially gives you an 8% durability boost to the unit, so on average saving less than 1 orc per 10 models that die. It also is on a time limit as well, as it goes away once the mob is a bit depleted, and that further makes it a little bit less relevant, though at least it does trigger when the attack's targeted, it would seem, so I guess you get to reroll all the ones if the overall attack from the enemy came in when you were still at a point when you had over half models left in a big squad. Overall though, between this and certainly all the stratagem support, it feels like you're going to want 120 Boyz in your army at 2000 points, and then fill out the rest with characters to lead them and a few things to help them deal with big tough stuff. Alternatively, just ignore all the special rules and things, do the 120 Boyz, and then just take all the rest of your points in beast snaggers. Looks like you can just about take over 200 Boyz in an army list if you take nothing but. Let's look at the stratagems that support them though, and these ones do maybe feel just a little bit overly restricted. They're literally all locked to the Boyz datasheet, so they don't help beast snaggers or any other horde orcs or elites. For 1 CP we've got Bulldozer Brutality. This one allows models in your Boyz units to fight within 3 inches against the target that they've got in engagement range. It usually amounts to fighting in 3 ranks pretty much. Could be helpful to fight around terrain, situationally good on a big 20 strong mob where you're probably going to struggle to get all of them fighting, but some of the time it might not be all that relevant or even worth the command point for the extra damage. For 1 CP there's Come On Lads. D3 + 2 orcs get to return to the mob in the command phase, and this one's just going to be a particularly good one for all kinds of reasons really. Essentially right then and there you've just restored 34 points to the army overall, which doesn't hurt at all, particularly in this army where you want as many Boyz as you can get. On top of that you also get the movement shenanigans of it. You could put them on objectives to score, you could restore the squad from say 8 Boyz up to 10 or more so you don't have to test battle shock, and you could potentially put them at the front of the units to shorten your eventual charge later in the turn. Could be the difference between them making a charge against a faraway target and not doing so. This one feels like it might be the single best stratagem out of them, adding both just raw power to the army plus also a fair few crafty options. Otherwise for 1 CP there's Competitive Streak, a battle tactics stratagem where your Boyz unit gets to reroll wound rolls of 1 in melee. That bit is kind of a bit whatever in the first place, but that goes up to rerolling all wound rolls if you've got 10 or more models in the mob. Definitely a world of difference there, as with all of those chopper attacks you're probably going to be wounding on a 5+ or worse against quite a few targets out there. This will mean that you get far more wounds on the enemy, and it'll also affect any attached characters such as war bosses or Painboyz or whatever. This one's definitely a great one to have around to be able to threaten tough stuff a bit better, which Horde armies often struggle with. I say that this one is the other really good one of the detachments. For 1 CP, we've got Bragging Rights. In your command phase, 2 Boyz units within 6 inches of each other both count as having 10 or more models for all the detachment rules, enhancements, and stratagem effects. I feel like this one's probably going to be barely worth the command point, maybe most impactful for allowing you to be 10 or more models, so you could trigger the full wound reroll stratagem if that makes sense, though you might have a chance of restoring them to 10 or more models with the Come On Lad stratagem, at least if you're kind of near that limit. The enhancements and the core detachment rule just don't really seem to be worth it enough to use this stratagem, even if it does affect 2 units in my opinion. For 1 CP, there's Tide of Muscle, which is a nice one. Boyz gets to add the current battle round number to their charge rolls. This could mean that you could have some super easy charges late game, and definitely could be worth using early game as well. Maybe if you came out of Strategic Reserve round 2 or 3, you could be looking at a 7-inch or a 6-inch charge. Really good if the charge is going to be game changing as to whether or not you get in or not, and seems particularly nice as well for weird boy jumping units. If you had a unit jump from one place to another turn 3, you're odds on to make the charge on the 6 inches. This one does seem really nice, unless things are going very badly, then hopefully you'll have at least some boys left by rounds 4 and 5. Finally, for 1 CP, we've got Go Get 'em. This one's a surge move of d6 inches directly towards the closest unit just after a boy's unit gets shot. You don't have to have lost any casualties, so you can guarantee that this will trigger even if your saves do hold out, and the move can be used to jump into melee with a nearby opponent if you roll high, and you do get an automatic 6-inch to that move if there's 10 or more models in the Boyz mob, as well as the big damage one plus the restore Boyz one. This one maybe feels like another really good one really. I guess the idea would be that you could have a big mob of Boyz in the middle of the board. The opponent probably moves up to try and contest objectives, or perhaps even charge your unit. If they then ping any firepower into your squad, you can threaten to just jump into combat with them, potentially ripping apart an enemy unit in their own turn. And if the enemy unit was just about to charge you, the order of operations should mean that you should get to fight first. Overall, this one's a really good one, and it definitely could play mind games with your opponent, not knowing if the Boyz are suddenly going to step up and hit you very hard if they ping a few shots into them. Overall, I do like the stratagems, a big extra damage one with rerolling wound rolls, a nice restoring Boyz one, and a nice jump into combat one. The bonus charge one definitely feels like it's usable as well, maybe more impactful later game though. Finally, there's a few good things for the bosses of the Horde. For a nice cheap 10 points, there's Ferocious Show Off. That's +1 strength for a character, rising to a +3 strength if you're in a 10 model unit or more. I'd say maybe it's not crazy, as it won't always matter. I guess it could push a war boss to strength 13 or strength 14. Might not be the worst for certain support characters as well. Feels like a points filler though, rather than one you go out of your way for. Brutal but Cunning is 25 points. This one gives you the chance to farm command points in the command phase, a 5+ normally, and then going up to a 3+ if they're in a squad of 10 or more. I feel like unfortunately in a world where grots exist, this one's kind of pointless really. I feel like most Ork army lists are going to be able to farm that command point on their home objective on a 4+ to start with, so it seems maybe a little bit underwhelming to just try and boost the chance of that, never mind if you manage to get some Gretchen into a safe place onto the midfield. I guess not awful though if you're not using them for whatever reason. For 15 points, there's Bloodthirsty Belligerents. This one allows you to reroll advanced rolls, and if you've got a unit of 10 or more, you get to reroll charge rolls as well. All of these are infantry only, by the way, and they don't necessarily revolve around being in Boyz units, though I feel like the majority of your leaders probably are going to be that way, given that the detachment is all about them. This one seems extra nice for the turn of the Waaagh. Rerolling both the advance and the charge is a lot more reliability on your charge threat range, and at only 15 points it seems alright. Again, I'm not sure it's strong enough to be considered auto-include or anything though. Finally, for 20 points, we've got Raucous Warcaller. This one means that your unit always counts as having 10 models or more for the detachment rule and any stratagems. It could mean that you get 1 or 2 more Boyz saves due to that reroll 1s to save option that they get. I feel like perhaps the biggest thing for this one though is that it means that you can always use that reroll wound stratagem on them and get full value out of it, even when you just had the boss, maybe an attached character and a few more Boyz left. Again, seems to be priced a little bit on the expensive side for 20 points. In all honesty, out of these I'm not really too crazy about the enhancements. I feel like all of these are just merely okay at best. I feel like you could have them or you could leave them behind. The core of the strength is going to be from the extra durable Boyz with the invulnerable saves, and the good stratagems to support them with surge moves, rerolling wounds, and respawning more. Will be interesting to see what sort of list people come up with for this one, whether it's going to be focusing on Boyz on foot, or maybe battle wagon units delivering them into combat, and what sort of things get taken in support to the Greenskin Horde, maybe a few things that can try and take out enemy heavies a bit more reliably perhaps, or add a bit of speed. The Kult of Speed is the new Orky formation representing speed freaks in-game, basically Orks but Mad Max, and basically the 10th edition interpretation of the speed mob formation from before. Adrenaline Junkies is the core rule for it seems, and this one allows speed freaks to shoot after advancing and after falling back, and I feel like both parts of that rule are really quite nice for buffing the buggies in particular. For an army of vehicles that's mainly going to do its damage with shooting, both of those are kind of standout really. Advancing is all rather nice, as of course that means more speed. Most of the buggies are going to be moving 12 inches, then an extra d6 inches, so they'll be able to gain line of sight, range and firepower very well. And in the turn that you call the Waaagh as well, they'll be getting their 5+ invulnerable save, and can also go on to charge even after advancing, which is rather nice. Otherwise though, and perhaps similarly meaningful if not more so, is the fall back and shoot, which I think is a really nice choice for this formation. Generally these buggies want to be getting up in the enemy's face and being a big disruptive threat on the board, but then they have problems when they get charged and they don't do all that much damage in close combat. It means that often you still want to be shooting the enemy unit that just charged you with all the rest of the buggies, so usually the one that's in combat wants to be dropping back rather than firing in melee with big guns never tire. And this rule basically allows you to still play aggressively, but not have to worry about losing the model's firepower if you get locked up. Really great to know that your opponent can't just nuisance charge you to disrupt you or hold you up too much. You can just fall back, keep on blazing, and still be moving across the board quite quickly to get where you need to be. And on top of that, it means that you can potentially do nuisance charges with a lot more confidence. The buggies have at least somewhat tanky profiles that it's going to be hard for your standard basic troopers to be able to chew through, and can just be annoying and get in the way and cause targeting priority issues for things like enemy vehicles. Means that you can fairly happily just crash your buggies straight into the enemy, cause your opponent difficult choices between falling back or getting suboptimal damage, and then when it comes back to your turn, provided they've not countercharged you or shot you down, you can then go on to do what you like. All this only applies to the Speed Freak datasheets, and in Codex Orks that's Warbikers and Deffkoptas, all the buggies including the Def Killer Wartrike, and interestingly enough, all the planes get the Speed Freak keyword this time round, and despite Games Workshop seemingly not liking to support aircraft with too many rules, a couple of them I think do get interesting in this detachment. You also have Speed Freaks on the Warbot on Warbike from the Forge World Index as well, though things like trucks and battle wagons don't get the Speed Freak keyword, though there are a couple of things within this detachment that could make you want to use them anyway. As per other Orky detachments, it doesn't lock you out of taking other stuff either, so you could still have Gretchen to hold down your home objective and farm some CP, and all sorts of nasty melee threats or other scary stuff in the army. Overall, I do think that that's really quite a good core rule for supporting the buggies in particular, and certainly doesn't hurt for the Deffkoptas and bikes either, means that you could be hurtling forward in the Waaagh and still shoot and then charge. Moving on to the stratagems, and for 1 CP, they're Speediest Freaks. This one gives you a 5+ invulnerable save when a Speed Freaks unit is attacked, it can be range or melee, and then that increases to a 4+ invulnerable save for vehicles of toughness 8 or less, so basically the buggies and the truck. In general, hard to go too far wrong with that, it's a really nice reactive defensive boost. You are only increasing the datasheets from the 6+ invulnerable save that they'd get anyway, but does mean that just your 1 key buggy or warbike unit will be harder to remove than your enemy might expect. Maybe the biggest downside being that you are affecting at least fairly cheap units with this. The buggies all clock in at 100 points or less pre-Codex. For 1 CP, there's one called Squig Flinging. This one is one where a Ork just literally chucks a squig out a window to surprise some nearby enemies. I'm sure that's exactly the sort of thing that they'd enjoy doing. You use this when a speed freak or truck ends a move within 9 inches of an enemy unit in the movement phase, and that triggers a single battle shock test at -1 to the test for that nominated enemy unit. I guess could occasionally be relevant for trying to score certain secondary objectives where you need to hold a point in the midfield perhaps, or stopping one enemy unit using a key stratagem. You could have a chance to prevent some really powerful stratagems if you wanted, but it's going to be unreliable as they could just pass that test. Moving into the big leagues though, and the Kult of Speed gets 2 fairly spectacular damage dealing stratagems. The first one is Daka Storm for 1 CP. This gives your Speed Freaks unit sustained hits 1 at range, which is pretty meaningful on Orky shooting where you hit on a 5+ normally. That's going to be a plus 50% damage increase, and it gets boosted to sustained hits 2 when you're within 9-inch range. This means if you can close the distance, it's essentially double firepower within 9 inches if you did hit on a 5+. For example, a maxed out unit of Warbikes with 6 models would average you 20 hits at Strength 5, AP 1, Damage 1 and Twin Links. Even the base 5+ profile could still be interesting, maybe on the Wasbomb Warplane when it comes in from reserve, though you wouldn't be able to trigger the 9-inch thing on the turn that it arrives. This one does seem genuinely threatening for zooming Warbikers or Deffkoptas into close range for some massive firepower, though it seems that we're going to be weighing it up against the next one. The other really big damage dealer is called Blitzerfire. This one's basically the same but with lethal hits. Again, it's a Speed Freaks unit, and for this one you get lethal hits on a 6 or critical hits on a 5+ if you're within 9 inches. It does specify that you can't combine this with Storm on the same unit for just some sort of ridiculous massive damage combo. It is one or the other, though both of them are great. If you were hitting on a 5+ and wounding on a 5+, this essentially amounts to literally just double damage straight out, even by getting lethal hits normally. That's pretty crazy for maybe things like the Megatrak Scrapjet, where you might be wounding vehicles on a 5+ with all those rockets. And then if you get to within half range, then that becomes essentially triple damage. On top of that, the Jet gets automatic criticals, so it doesn't even need to be within 9 inches to get the lethal hits on 5s and 6s. That means that crazy plane will absolutely love this. Every 5 or 6 will both get a sustained hit and a lethal hit, so that'll stack a whole ton of wounds on the enemy. Seems like it could be quite nice on the Deffkoptas as well, though they do get twin linked on their rockets. Just in general, this seems like a very nice way to try and punch up against tough stuff though. Otherwise, for 1 CP, we've got Full Throttle, +1 to wound on the charge. Again, pretty handy for Deffkoptas or Warbikers trying to take down something a bit unusually tough, particularly if you've got a Deffkiller Wartrike or a Warboss on Warbike attached. Finally, for 1 CP, there's more Gits over here. This one's again a really nice one to have, a reactive normal move of 6 inches if the enemy moves within 9 inches of a Speed Freaks unit. This one's pretty much always nice to have in a detachment, really means that your opponent can't fully plan of exactly where your army is going to be. Often most impactful if they want to move something up to try and charge your unit and then it just scoots away and they're out of range. Or perhaps if they move up for a unit that wants to take an objective, and then all of a sudden your scary buggy or warbikes or whatever suddenly hide behind terrain so the biggest, scariest guns can't shoot them. Overall, I feel like it's really quite a solid stratagem section there, more so than many of the rest. A nice reactive durability boost, 3 strong damage boosts, and a good reactive move. Hard to go too far wrong with that. I guess they have allowed themselves a bit more craziness with the power of the stratagems, given that most of these can only affect sort of slightly lower investment units. I guess still a maxed out Warbiker squad with a Deffkiller Trike or a maxed out Deffkoptas squad though could still get some pretty massive efficiency out of these. Otherwise, for the Kult of Speed, we've got the enhancements. First up, we've got the lovely names Waaagh Blaster. This one's Deffkiller Wartrike only, and it's recorded at 10 points in the Codex. It gives the Deffkiller Wartrike a move shoot move 6 inches, but it can't charge after. I guess that means that you could have some drive-by Warbikers going really quite quickly. If you're advancing and shooting with the Deffkiller's automatic 6-inch to advance, then that'll be 18 inches. Get within that 9-inch range for their AP boost perhaps, maybe unload one of those damage stratagems, and then move another 6 inches, so potentially 24 inches moved in a turn, would still be able to unload some scary firepower. I guess you would have to weigh that up against charging though. If you started the turn kind of close to the enemy already, it might just make more sense to move up, shoot and charge. It's not like the enemy's locking you in combat in this. Seems alright to have for 10 points as a point filler though. Perhaps one of the other really exciting ones that's also the most expensive is Faster Than Use. This one's an infantry model one, and it means that you can disembark from a transport model that's moved and still charge after. It's basically assault ramp but for orcs. This one's very expensive, but in my opinion it's well worth it. It turns your truck or battle wagon into essentially like an orky land raider. Pretty intimidating to think that you could have a great big battle wagon move its full 12 inches towards the enemy, perhaps have a warboss and a full unit of mega knobs jump out. They'd be jumping out the front so an extra 3 inches closer, and then going on for a charge. That's an average of 22-inch threat range from the battle wagon there. Basically means that you could pretty much charge a unit from your deployment zone to the enemy's one, maybe not a first turn charge, though one would certainly be easily achievable if the enemy moves forward even a little bit. I feel like a battle wagon might be one of the most obvious things for that. You could do it on a Gorkanaut, Morkanaut, Squigoth or Stomper or Truck squad. Loads of possibilities with this one. You could even use it on beast snaggers jumping out of a kill rig or hunter rig. Next up, we've got the Squig Hide tyres for 15 points. This one's a consolidate of 6 inches for the Death Killer Wartrikes units. Not awful for jumping into another enemy unit to disrupt them and tie them up or moving on to an objective, but 15 points seems like at least a fair bit for something that won't be relevant every game. You're usually going to be reliant on actually wiping out infantry units in the fight phase, and while Warbikers aren't awful in combat, they're also not all that, so I'm a little bit less sold on this one really. Finally, you've heard of might makes right, but what about speed makes right? This one's 25 points, and in the command phase you farm a command point if you're within 9 inches of an enemy unit, and you can take this on any Ork character model, it doesn't have to be a speed freak or anything. I feel like for 25 points it would be okay but not stand out if it was in a Codex in isolation. In reality though, in a Codex where Gretchen exists and it's 40 points to get command point farming and also put like 22 OC on your home objective, I can't really see this one really being worth it versus the other things. Overall, I feel like standout for value here is Faster Than Youth for 35 points. That's just awesome for getting some scary Ork melee all the way up the board. And otherwise, for an opportunistic Death Killer Wartrike points filler, Waagh's Blaster does seem nice. Move Shoot Move is often disruptive, and you could use this after falling back as well. I feel like for 10 points there's going to be enough times in game when that's worth bringing along. Overall, I think the Games Workshop have done at least fairly well in a Speed Freak support package there. They do have some genuine damage boosts that are meaningful enough to make their buggies and bikes punch up against tougher things. Reactive moves and invulnerable saves are good, and the core rule is really good for making your army move faster and not get pinned down. It does feel like it's all very on theme. Next up, we've got the Shock Elite of the Orks in the Bully Boys. This one's an interesting detachment, focusing on knobs and mega knobs mainly, and particularly things led by war bosses, an alternative way to a big violent Ork list, but just really focusing in on just a few units. The core rule for this one is called The Boss is Watching, and it means that provided you've got a war boss keyword model on the battlefield or in a transport on the battlefield, you can call a second Waaagh later in the game. That Waaagh only applies to knobs, mega knobs, and units led by war bosses though, so it's not your entire faction. The war boss keyword is one that's been handed out in this codex. You do get it on beast bosses, Squigosaur bosses, and Ghazghkull Thraka himself has it as well, so it does mean it maybe shouldn't be too hard to have at least one of those units on the board. Plus it means that second Waaagh could affect a bunch of things that aren't necessarily the focus of the detachment. You could get Squighog Boys with 2 turns of Waaagh here if you wanted, even if the rest of the rules don't really help them. You are swapping out the sustained hits in melee across the entire army, so a bit more sustained and constant violence for 2 really big turns of it, but having 2 turns worth of Waaagh is kind of enormous for Orks. It does give you an absolutely massive boost in terms of speed, danger, and durability, and this one does affect units that are pretty scary as well. Regular knobs have been pretty competitive in Ork lists so far, and this detachment feels like it's extra nice for mega knobs, as they had their special rule altered around a bit, getting a 4+ feel no pain when they're in the Waaagh. Means that those guys between the invulnerable saves and that are just going to be spectacularly tanky to take out, and if you could have that going off on turns 2 and 3, then you could have an Orky Deathwing stomping around the board with near impunity. Overall, it definitely feels like it's got enough threat to the rule to make it scary and worth playing versus the other detachments. For the stratagems, literally all of them are locked to knobs units or mega knobs units, though at least both of them are suitably big and dangerous enough that you might want to be using stratagems for extra damage and defense on them. For 1 CP, we've got Armed to the Teeth. That's a battle tactic for reroll hit rolls of 1 when you're shooting or fighting, or you get to reroll all hit rerolls in the Waaagh. Feels like in general that's going to be one that you want on the units in melee when you're hitting on a 4+, going to hitting a lot more of the time, particularly in the same turns that you're getting the extra attacks and bonus strength as well. Just going to be some fantastically threatening units with extra violence on tap. I guess you could try and make some sort of odd Orky Sternguard combi weapon unit work. Realistically though, I feel like your Power Claws are going to be the better bet. For 1 CP, there's Too Arrogant to Die, which is quite a nice titled stratagem I think. Units attacked get to either shoot or fight on death on a 5+ per model, and you get to add 2 to the dice roll in the Waaagh, so that's be fighting on death on a 3+, which does seem pretty big if you get countercharged on one of these violent units after they've dealt their first wave of damage. Knobs definitely feel like the sort of units that could be pretty weak to enemies countercharging after they've charged in and presumably broken something on the first turn. If the enemy is mainly a melee army and absolutely needs to destroy them in close combat, this could be an absolutely brutal way to take a massive chunk out of them as they go down, and just for 1 CP. For 1 command point, there's Always Looking for a Fight. This one gives you a D3+3 consolidate or a 6-inch one in the Waaagh. A nice one to have access to, though it's not always super meaningful. I guess the idea would usually be to have a unit charge and destroy an enemy unit, and then use that extra movement if you need it to get to an objective or another squad, or otherwise you can just use your normal consolidate if you don't need that boost. It can be pretty powerful though, even if your opponent is trying to spread out. A big 6-inch consolidate could be enough to tag something that's surprisingly far away, and cause real headaches for the opponent whether or not they choose to fall back in the next turn, something that you can absolutely compound with another one of the stratagems. Next up, for 1 CP, we've got Crushing Impact. Again, it's knobs or mega knobs, and after you charge, you roll 1d6 per model of yours that you've got into an engagement range. On a 5+, you deal 1 mortal wounds each, going up to a 4+ in the Waaagh. I guess on a big unit of knobs with an attached character, that's usually going to average around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds there. The stratagem does cap out at a 6 mortal wound maximum to deal damage. It really does depend on how many models you can actually get into an engagement range though, as often they might block each other. And I feel like you'd have to make the decision as to whether or not you've already got enough violence on tap to destroy your foe. I guess if it was something that was just extra tough with a 2+ save or high and vulnerable, then it could be worth the extra damage coming in. Maybe things with -1 damage in particular, which could be bad news for power claws. For 1 CP, we've got Cut 'em Down, which is quite a fun one. After an enemy unit gets selected to fall back, they must test Desperate Escape and take -1 to the test in the Waaagh. This one's really quite brutal and could be a bit of a gotcha type mechanic, I think. Probably one to mention to the opponent that you have in the box of tricks before the game starts. It might mean that opponents just can't afford to drop back your units from melee with your knobs or mega knobs, or take a pretty brutal running the risk of, say, losing something really important. Could be crazy if they lost something like a battle tank on an unlucky roll this way. It could put them in 2 really bad situations though, particularly if they're a gunline army and don't have things to countercharge you with. If they leave the unit in combat, then you might well just do loads of damage to it in the fight phase anyway, so every which way they lose. Finally, for 1 CP, we've got Hulking Brutes, worsen AP by 1 by enemy shooting against this unit, really quite nice for mega knobs. Basically Orky Armor of Contempt, really quite good given that they don't get an invulnerable save at base, bar custom force fields or the Waaagh. Given that they get their 4+ feel no pain in the Waaagh turns, that just makes them just ridiculously tanky. Though I think it's just quite nice to have on tap anyway. They're fairly big chunky models with a big toughness 6, 3 wounds and a 2+ save. If they get cover, they could already be debuffing the enemy AP, and this could seriously allow them to weather some storms. Overall, just between the core rule and the stratagems, there's a whole ton of strength here. Rerolling all hits is nice, violent, and dangerous. The consolidate thing could cause problems, and then maybe double down on those problems with making a few enemies die when they try and fall back. The fight on death is a very big deal against certain melee armies, and Hulking Brute seems great for mega knobs. Overall, there really is a lot to like here. I feel like you'd still want some grots along to farm some command points for you. Finally, for the best of the best, we've got the bosses. 1 Mega Armoured War Boss gets a Teleporter, 25 points for their Mega Armor units to gain Deep Strike. You could do a bit of an Orky Deathwing formation type here. Mega Knobs are going to be key to the army in general, and you could do some fun things like Rapid Ingress them potentially, have them drop down behind cover, not get shot, and then get a near guaranteed charge on the enemy. Big Gob is for an infantry war boss only. At the start of the fight phase, 1 unit that's in engagement range with you takes a battle shock at -1 to the test. Maybe a little bit on the niche side, this one really. Could stop some stratagems or stop them contesting some of your secondary objectives, but a bit rubbish beyond that. The biggest boss is 15 points for +2 wounds to an infantry war boss. I guess it doesn't hurt and means that you could have an extremely tanky mega boss perhaps. At 15 points for just 2 wounds extra and no extra damage threat though, it feels a bit borderline. And then finally for 10 points we have Head Stomper. Reroll 1s to wound against units that are below starting strength, or full wound rerolls against things below half strength. This one's for the bearer only, so not for their squad or anything like that. I feel like 10 points is probably just going to be a points filler, not really going to be that big a deal, but certainly doesn't hurt to have a few rerolls on a boss with a nasty power claw. I feel like the majority of these are just ones that you might think about for points to round out a list that you've got an awkward number of points left for. The only one that I think is maybe more than that is Teleporter. Having Deep Strike on Mega Knobs seems interesting, particularly in this detachment. Overall though, provided knobs and mega knobs remain to be costed competitively, I feel like this one seems strong. You will be losing a fair bit of overall violence in not having the sustained hits compared with the War Horde, but 2 turns of Waaagh is kind of immense, and most of the stratagems are just downright scary, rerolling hits, fighting on death, cutting enemies down when they try and flee, and debuffing AP against mega knobs. Overall feels like a fun detachment. I feel like you could have a lot of very violent greenskins rocking up the board in trucks or battle wagons and then jumping on the foe. Finally, for the Codex detachments, we have the War Horde, which is basically the renamed version of the Waaagh tribe from the Index. Sadly, they've chosen to spell it War, not Waaagh this time, maybe to try and avoid a bit of confusion with the core rule, maybe. The core rule for this one does remain the nice, simple, and effective sustained hits worn in melee, usually going to be around a 25% damage buff, even more relevant for things that hit a bit worse, things like Mega Knobs with Power Claws. Hard to go too far wrong with this. Orks have got loads of good melee units, and it feels just simple, effective, and goffs. It is going to be a detachment that mainly builds around melee things, and range stuff is going to be underwhelming compared with things like Dreadmob. It's maybe a bit of a shame that the Codex didn't have a more general purpose shooting detachment that just vaguely helps out things like shooter boys and things that aren't mech led. I feel like that might have been one of the other things that was on the wish list, perhaps. Getting into stratagems, and unlike the custodies that are releasing alongside, this one seems to be mainly the same, which I think is broadly a good thing, as the index attachment has some strong options. Kareen does make vehicles a little bit more interesting in this one. If you roll Deadly Demise for an Ork's vehicle unit, then you get to make a normal move before it explodes. It's only going to come up every so often, but being able to position that explosion away from your own troops and towards the enemy could genuinely swing a fair bit of damage into the enemy's face. And more than that, it's particularly good for transports as well, which, never mind the explosion, means that you could move your transport in such a way to disembark the unit somewhere safe behind cover, or right up in the enemy's face if that makes more sense. Basically, each time you roll a Deadly Demise, if you roll that 6 on the dice, you can just look at the board state and decide whether or not that's worth it. Sometimes it will be absolutely game changing, though plenty of times not worth it. For 1 CP, there's Unbridled Carnage. This one's a nice easy critical hits on a 5+, with the detachment rule that adds up to a whole load of sustained hits, usually a 20% damage boost compared with what you'd have before with the detachment rule. Not a bad one to turn on if you've got an absolutely critical melee where you need to deal every bit of damage possible, otherwise you're going to get hit back hard. The bigger the melee unit that you can affect, the better, and the math of it is a little bit more favourable if you are only hitting on something weak like a 4+ before. If you can get lethal hits on this one, that could be a way to double dip on critical and sustained hits. Gazgul with Makari can get that in the Waaagh, and that could be particularly relevant if they're around. For 2 CP, there's Orks is Never Beaten, just fights on death for 1 Orks unit, no need to roll. You declare this when you're selected as a target as opposed to when things die. And again, it's potentially powerful, meaning that you could fight in death with a whole load of scary things, potentially massively punish your opponent for killing one of their best melee things, but at 2 CP it really is quite pricey, and you do have to commit to it before you know how much damage you're taking. For 1 CP, Arda's Nails is a generally good one. This one's a nice simple -1 to wound, that you can't use it on vehicles, Gretchin, or monsters. There's no stipulation that the -1 to wound only applies if their strength is greater than your toughness or anything like that, so it's pretty devastatingly powerful if they were going to wound you on a 5+, which is sometimes the case given that Ork units have toughness 5. Could be massive for, say, strength 4 hitting toughness 5 boys. The monsters bit, I guess, means that you can't use this on the Squigoths anymore, which could be kind of big in the past. Squigosaur bosses are now mounted units, so you can still use it on them if you'd like, and it still feels like a particularly nice one to be using on a big set of Squighog boys moving up the board. Generally, I consider this one a pretty good value defensive stratagem. For 1 CP, we've got Mob Rule. This one's altered a bit, as it previously only allowed you to just use stratagems on the unit even if you were battle shocked, which I thought was super niche. I say it's improved a bit, but maybe not loads. If you're battle shocked on an Ork infantry unit that's within 6 inches of a 10 Ork mob keyword unit, so things like Boyz or Beastnagger boys, or most of the things on foot, then you can basically cancel that battle shock at the end of the command phase, and I believe that that would mean that you could cancel that here and then go on to score objectives that are also done at the end of the command phase, so it could be relevant to swing some victory points sometimes. It does feel that the units that you need to have in the right positions are kind of niche though. Doesn't hurt to have some bigger mobs around, I guess, but I feel like this one's going to be seldom used. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Here We Go, which does seem to be the same as it was in the index, +2 to advance and charge for an Ork infantry unit declared at the start of your movement phase. This one's absolutely great in the turn of the Waaagh, given that it's going to be just an extra 4-inch threat to your Orks. It means that on average on that turn you go around about 20 inches in terms of charge threat range. Faster infantry could potentially move further, and it works particularly well with a Weird Boy unit as well. You could be getting a 7-inch charge out of Deep Strike. Glad to see that one's remained. I'm sure it will remain a bit of a staple for getting things to go across the board super quick. Overall, no enormous changes on the stratagems there. Arda's Nail still being around is a very good thing, I think, and otherwise this one in Here We Go I think is still going to be a staple. Unbridled Carnage is usually useful on the biggest and most important melee around, and Kareen I think is situationally great, though it's not going to come up every game. Finally, for the War Horde, we have the enhancements. The printed codex costs of these are really quite different to the ones that we had digitally. I'm not sure whether or not they will just be updated to this one or stay with the digital versions. Follow me lads, it's 15 points printed, it was 25 before. This one gives you a plus 2-inch move to the unit. Definitely handy enough for getting a squad across the battlefield as fast as possible. Could be nice on Squig Hog Boys, or basically anything that's trying to foot slog. If that's gone down to 15 points, I feel like it'd be a lot more tempting. Headwhopper's Kill Chopper is listed at 10 points here, it was 20 before. That's the one that gives melee weapons that aren't extra attacks devastating wounds, so it's really good on anything with anti-keywords. Most notably, the Beast Chopper on the Squigosaur boss means that every 4+ against a monster or vehicle will be a devastating wound, really quite a lot of carnage there. Previously, this one was often taken on the Knob on the Smasher Squig, given that he had anti-keywords as well, but now he's not an individual character anymore, so he wouldn't be relevant for that. If it's 10 points, it seems nice and cheap. Basically looks like it's auto-include on a Squigosaur boss if you're not taking anything else. I still say it's not awful on a regular war boss as well. Every so often will punch just a little bit more damage through invulnerable saves and things. Next up, we've got Cunning but Brutal for 20 points. This one allows you to fall back, shoot and charge. Not the worst to have on a big unit moving up the board. It looks like it's 20 points here and was 15 before. Maybe could be a nice one to have on a Deathkiller Wartrike and some bikes maybe. And finally we have the Super Cyborg Body, which is printed at 25 points, which is quite a lot more than the 15 it was before. That one gives you a 4+ Feel No Pain type save. It feels like the maximal tankiness that you get out of this is again on the Deathkiller Wartrike maybe. A 4+ Feel No Pain just flat out doubles its durability. Makes it really quite a chunky model to remove even if it was running just completely solo. Or it could just otherwise increase the tankiness of things like the War Boss in Mega Armor. And it is usable on the Beast Boss on Squigosaur now, given that that dropped down to a 5+ Feel No Pain. If it really is up to 25 points though, I think it's going to be far more niche as it doesn't add you any killing power. Perhaps a maybe one on the Deathkiller Wartrike, probably not on other things though. Overall again, I feel like most of these are okay on the right model, but not crazy go out of your way to include. For 15 points the 2-inch move on otherwise sort of like medium speed Ork units does seem great. Headwhopper's Kill Chopper for 10 points seems like an excellent point filler, going up to being auto-include on the Beast Chopper of a Squigosaur boss. Overall quite nice to see that they haven't really messed with this one too much. I think it did the job really quite well for an Ork melee violence sort of detachment. An all-around easy to use detachment rule and some fairly direct damage and defensive stratagems feels very Orks all in all. Overall, between all that, I think that Games Workshop have broadly done really quite well with these Orky detachments. I feel like they're in the position where they make the different ways to play genuinely interesting and different. Depending on what they do with points cost for the unit, I really feel like you could have pretty much most of these do okay. I think my first instinct's that the Bully Boys and the Dread Mob are two of the most interesting, along with the War Horde from the Index. I feel like Green Tide, the Big Hunt, and the Cult of Speed all offer interesting things, but maybe not quite as much just all-around raw value, though it does seem that they'd be perfectly playable in more casual games, and of course if any of their super relevant units do just get very very good after the points cost and everything are revealed, then they're going to be kind of prominent just due to that. I really like the flavour though, I feel like they have dared to give them some fairly interesting and strong rules here, far more so than certain golden codexes that have been revealed recently. Let's move on from detachments though and talk datasheets. First up, we'd better mention the Fallen. There's 51 datasheets in total, which is down from the 57 previously in the index, and that basically means that 7 of them have been lost or consolidated, given that we've gained the new generic Big Mek, which didn't actually have a datasheet before. It's kind of sad to say goodbye to the official in the Codex rules for Zagstruck, Grotsnik, Captain Badrock, and the Knob with the Waaagh banner. I feel like the unique characters in particular are kind of sad to go away, given that they just add a bit of flavour, and it was nice to have a dedicated unique character for say the freebooters, plus Grotsnik, who's sort of integral to the whole setup of Ghazghkull. I guess it's not guaranteed that they won't come back in a new plastic character release at some point in the future, though it won't be in this edition. In terms of competitive play, I feel like Captain Badrock is the biggest hit out of these by a long way. He was rather savage in leading his flash kits into some serious firepower. It feels like if anything they'd probably need a points cut to remain in any way relevant as a shooting unit after that. Them being actually good and competitive was very dependent on him. Otherwise, the Mech Boy workshop has gone away. The only fortification now is the Big Ed Boss Bunker. The knob on Smasher Squig, as mentioned, has been consolidated into the Squig Hog Boys. It means that you get a chunkier base unit of 4 of them now, and you can still double up on the squad, which is kind of big. And the Big Mek with the custom force field has been replaced by the regular mech. There's no way to get a custom force field on regular boys anymore. The only option for an invulnerable save for shooting is for the Mega Knob one. Overall, it's never nice to see core units go away, particularly if you happen to have the models yourself, and at least say that most of these can still be proxied as units in game. Use Captain Badrock as a war boss maybe, or Mad Doc Grotznik as a Painboy. And of course in more casual games, I'm sure with some permission you could still use their index datasheets if you wanted to. Before we get into the main cut and thrust of datasheets, I thought I'd just take one slide to particularly underline the fact that the printed points costs are broadly not relevant. I feel like in 10th edition, just about every Codex review that I've done so far has had a fair few people commenting how disappointed they were to see certain units go up in points so much. The points that are printed in the Codex just aren't relevant to current 40k. They broadly haven't really changed much since the initial launch of 10th edition, despite the fact that we're several digital balance updates down the line and quite a lot has changed since then. For the vast majority of the units in the Codex, I'd be more looking at their more recent digital points as the best guide of what they're going to cost when Games Workshop does give us the new digital downloads. For the codexes that we've had so far, they've usually tended to stay very similar to the digital points that we had before, sometimes even when some units get some really quite radical changes to them, though some of the times when units have been almost rewritten, that does come with a points change for better or worse. In my opinion, at present the only points that are worth paying attention to are the ones for the new Big Mek and the ones for the enhancements. They're all new things, so we only have the Codex points to go by for that. And otherwise I certainly wouldn't pay too much attention to the printed points for the other units in the book. Games Workshop will issue a new digital points download somewhere between the 15th and 27th of April. I'll absolutely be covering that here on the channel, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see that. Most of the points will stay very similar though, and we can get a very good idea as to how the army will function and what's looking good or not with the new detachments. Then it'll be more of a case of just seeing if anything is particularly standout, stronger or weaker or expected if Games Workshop does decide to change some things on the points costs. With all that out the way, there's definitely some common themes in Orky datasheets. The battle line units in the index are both Boyz and Beast Snagger Boys. You can take up to 6 units of either of them. I have seen some lists going heavy on them. They are a bit more usable as troops compared with many. Gretchen are very good, but they aren't battle line. They only get battle line in Dread Mob, so you can't spam little runts unless you're there. Kind of fun that you could have that sort of build as a bit of a Gretchen revolution though, with a bunch of Gretchen and cans if you'd like though. Otherwise, for common themes in the Ork army, generally units tend to be tough in terms of toughness characteristics but somewhat low saves. For example, standard Boyz are toughness 5 but a 5+ save, and they do retain their 2 wound knob leaders. Means that some weapons are maybe surprisingly ineffective against them, maybe going for higher AP or lower strength, but some units can absolutely go through them very quickly. Things like high strength, low AP things or lethal hits. Vehicles still get a sort of pseudo ramshackle rule, broadly represented by having a 6+ invulnerable save. That one's a bit more relevant for extremes of AP or things with lower saves. Beast Snaggers get a bit more durability by having a cross-faction feel no pain, maybe a bit more relevant on the multi-wound things compared with the standard Boyz, though it certainly helps. They do have lots of rules that get anti-vehicle or anti-monster, or rerolls against those sort of things like the standard Beast Snaggers have. There's still some leftover ideas from the Daka weapon class that they had in 9th edition. They've got a lot of rapid fire weapons that, rather than just flatly doubling the amount of shots you get, are kind of a bit more effective out to longer range and just a little bit better up close. For example, the shooter gets 2 shots out to 18 inches and 3 shots within 9. And for the most part, Orks tend to have leadership 7. They're not one of the standout good leadership armies, and they're certainly not quite as immune to leadership in big mobs as they were maybe in 8th edition. Jumping into it though, let's talk about this shiny new model and go through the rest of the datasheets in turn. The new Big Mek's the one that's launching alongside the 10th edition Codex. Really quite a cool model in my opinion, with a big exo frame and some serious firepower. He seems just to be a generalist sort of model, with his Codex points listed at 80 points. For his stat line, he moves 6 inches, 6 wounds at toughness 5, a 3+ save and no invulnerable. He's at least somewhat durable for a character, but maybe not crazily so, and he's got the option to lead knobs, looters, mech guns or boys. For his ranged weapons you get the choice of either a tractor blaster or a custom mega blaster. This might maybe looking a little bit bigger than the average one. The custom Mega Blaster does just have the standard profile, 3 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage d6, hitting on a 5+. Custom Mega Blasters are also hazardous as well. The Tractor Blaster's a fun profile, though not very reliable, just one shot that hits on a 5, strength 10, AP 2 and damage d6 plus 1, but it gets the fun combo of anti-fly and devastating wounds, so if you wound any enemy unit on a 3+ with fly, you get really quite a lot of damage against them. They both seem okay, really. I feel like the custom Mega Blaster does have the edge taken off, with the chance to take a whole load of damage though, which isn't ideal. In melee, you get the choice between a Driller, which is 2 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage 3, or the Claw, which is more sort of a standard power claw, 4 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2. Both of them are alright, really. The Driller's slightly better against anything that's say toughness 10 or above, or against Terminators. The Claw's better against infantry. Maybe not absolutely loads in it, I feel like the profiles are at least fairly balanced, maybe depends on what you want to add more of to your squad. Finally, for his special rules, for actually leading the unit, he gets the Shock Booster special rule, that's the teleport gizmo that he has on his back, and that means that the squad gets to move through enemy models and terrain as if they were flying or something, and also get to reroll advanced rolls as well. I guess could be situationally handy if they got locked up and wrapped around by a big enemy unit, or useful enough if you call the Waaagh to be able to re-roll the dice and ensure you against a low advance roll. Otherwise he gets maybe the sort of standard Meks sort of special rule, re-rolling ones to hit at range, which I guess is a lot more relevant for the looters and the mech guns compared with Boyz and knobs. Overall, I must admit on his base stats and his special rules for the points, I don't think he's very strong. Hitting on a 5+, his shooting isn't going to be reliable enough to actually scare people. His melee isn't too much better than a standard unit leader, and his special rules feel maybe a little bit confused. The shock booster helps out a little bit with getting towards the fights, but not to a crazy extent, not like a weird boy or something. And the reroll ones to hit is an okay boost, but doesn't really synergize with him being in close combat where he has a fair bit more of his damage. Just perhaps feels like he doesn't have a super obvious unit that he really enjoys just getting along with all around, which maybe is a shame for most detachments given that it's really quite a cool model and it is the launch model for the Orks. I feel like perhaps actually the biggest impact that he could have will be giving the Mek keyword to particularly the knobs or the Boyz. That means they could use the damage boost from Dread Mob, so you could have knobs with lethal hits or sustained hits in close combat, which is kind of fun. And the same with a whole bunch of Boyz either shooting or fighting. He could make them genuinely really quite a lot more threatening in Dread Mob, and I feel like that'd be the place to run him if any. Even there though, you will be competing against the other flavours of mech that you can get, the mini mech that costs far less points, and the shock attack gun one which can join those same units. So I guess if you're competing with the shock attack gun at least, you need to decide whether or not you want far more firepower or is more sort of melee profile plus that advance roll. If you do want to use him in Dread Mob though, then that seems pretty reasonable. It does look like the Stomper Boyz Battle Force box set is kind of set up to do that. Getting into the datasheets proper though, let's start out with Ork Infantry, then mounted units, then go through the vehicles and wind up with characters. First up we have the standard Boyz, fairly common in competitive lists at the moment, fairly good quality violence backed up by a war boss. The standard Ork has objective control 2 which is good for objective scoring, toughness 5 and the 5+ save they get, and generally people tend to prefer running them with choppers over shooters, 3 attacks at strength 4, AP 1, damage 1, getting much better in the Waaagh. You get a knob with a power claw, plus some rockets in the squad, and if you take a 20 strong squad of them, then you can attach 2 characters to them, which could be kind of interesting in Green Tide. The biggest change besides detachment stuff for the Boyz is their special rule changed around. It previously was a War Boss Battleshock style rule, which wasn't useless, but wasn't really that great in my opinion. And it was weird to have a special rule that was locked to having another very specific character lead the unit. The new one is Get the Good Bits, a sticky objective style rule. If at the end of the command phase you are holding the objective, it's now yours until your opponent can hold it at the start or end of any turn. Pretty handy to mark your home objective at least with this with a unit of Boyz before they move on. And could be handy in the midfield, say if you had a unit of Boyz holding it and they get gunned down but the opponent can't reach it, the objective would still be yours. Overall probably still going to be an important part of army lists, very relevant in Green Tide, nice in the War Horde as they are now, and could be interesting for Dread Mob led by Meks, or the Bully Boys if led by a War Boss. Overall seems like broadly improved. For the Beast Snagger Boys, there are 105 points per 10 pre-Codex. You can have 10 to 20 in a mob as with the standard Boyz, and these are basically just an improved version of the datasheet pretty much. They get +1 strength from their choppers, a 6+ feel no pain type save, and a damage dealer special rule that allows you to reroll hit rolls against monsters and vehicles being Beast Snaggers. The power snapper on the knob is alright as well, basically a big chopper with +1 attack. I feel like they're pretty well balanced against the regular boys, have some positives but then also do cost more. They will have different access to characters as well, though both war bosses and beast bosses are good, they just do slightly different things. The Gretchen I feel like are going to remain a competitive staple. Currently it's 40 points per 11 pre-codex, including 1 runt herd per 10 grots. Really easy to kill individually at toughness 2 and just a 7+ save, so normally no save unless they get cover, and a few grot blaster shots if they can get something within 12-inch range. They get loads of objective control though at OC2, and they still get leadership 7 due to the runt herd, so they're pretty great to have on backfield objectives, particularly due to their thieving scavenger special rule, giving them a 4+ chance to farm a command point. It's usually worth having at least one of these on your home objectives just for that. Otherwise, just having cheap 40-point units that have a lot of objective control is really not the worst for doing secondary objectives. I feel like you could do worse than just march a couple of these towards the midfield points or put one in strategic reserve. And they do get battle line in Dread Mob as well, so in theory you could put a lot of grots on the board if you wanted to. The only major change they got in the Codex was that they no longer generate the command point on a 4+ if they're battle shocked, so maybe a little bit less reliable for doing that if they take some indirect damage or something like that, though most of the time hopefully they can stay safe and hide out of line of sight. Next up we've got the Storm Boys, 65 points per 5 pre-Codex, and their stat line's basically just boys with jump packs, the same stat line with choppers plus power claws, moving 12 inches with fly. They get the deep strike keyword, so can be quite nice for dropping for secondary objectives, and their special rule got a small improvement in the Codex, no longer risking you the chance of destroying your own models if you try and advance and charge, and also got the buff of being able to fall back and charge for the unit, which is rather nice. In general, it is just pretty handy to be able to fling a unit of boys halfway across the table and pretty much guarantee being struck before you get struck yourself, though just literally having a unit that can jump around doing secondaries is nice enough in itself. Commandos with 135 points pre-codex, looks like their datasheet is entirely unchanged. These are Orky infiltrators with stealth who get a few fun shooting and melee profiles within the unit, like the Breacher Ram and the Special Commando Shooter. They are still locked to a 10-man unit, which I think is kind of a weakness really. Often for infiltrating units you want them to be kind of cheap, so you don't have to go max investment on them. Potentially infiltrating could be pretty fun though. You could certainly get the jump on some outlying enemy infantry with a lot of greenskin violence. Otherwise they're immune to Overwatch and get a distraction grot for a once per game 5+ invulnerable save versus shooting, which is fun, plus a bomb squig for some mortal wounds. Ideally, if you take some along, you want to have some start on a midfield objective out of line of sight if possible, and be prepared to charge enemy units that get somewhere close. They maybe were a bit niche in competitive play pre-codex though. Tank Busters were 110 points pre-codex and were really quite overcosted for the orcs that should in theory be bringing down vehicles. One of the main issues is they have to take a variety of weapons within the unit. One must take a tank hammer and one must take a pair of rocket pistols, where probably you'd just rather have them all with regular rocket launchers. I guess we won't see any sort of major update for these guys until they get a new kit, which they do kind of badly need being old to find cast resin. Otherwise they get to add 1 to hit and wound versus monsters and vehicles, which makes them a little bit more of a threat, plus they have a pair of bomb squigs. Really, if these were to be good as an anti-tank type unit though, they would have to go down in points and by really quite a lot. Looters with their cobbled together def guns are 50 points per 5 pre-codex, really quite cheap and kind of similar to Beast Snagger Boys for orcs with some fairly heavy firepower. The change that happened for them in the codex was that their squad size is limited from 5 to 10, when previously it was 5 to 15, which I guess would make it a little bit less useful for stratagems and mech leadership purposes in Dread Mob, but still I feel like that's probably enough orcs to be worth leading. Def guns get you 2 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 out to 48 inches, 3 within 24. They hit on 6s but are heavy to hit on 5s, and they're particularly good at gunning enemies off objectives as you get to re-roll the hit roll against anything on an objective marker. That kind of volume fire will just absolutely love any of the buffs given to it by the Dread Mob detachment. I feel like you could have units of 10 of these with a Big Mek with a shock attack gun, and that could be kind of fun. Not sure whether the overall deal would quite add up to the equivalent weight in things like killer cans or shooty walkers of one sort or another, but I feel like if they're going to work anywhere, it's probably Dread Mob. For their partners in crime, we have the Burner Boys. The orcs with flamethrowers were 60 points per 5 pre-codex. Again, like the looters, their squad size has been slightly toned down, 10 models max now. Otherwise, perhaps an important change for them is they don't have any leader options now. The Meks can't join them for whatever reason, which is kind of a shame as they could have used some of the options from Dreadmob quite well, maybe particularly the extra AP on critical wounds. They get a bunch of flamethrowers that can be quite good for Overwatch. The Spanner, which is 1 per 4, as with the Looters, gets either a custom Mega Launcher or a Rocket Launcher, and they also get a damage rule against units on objectives, rerolling wound rolls of 1 just in general within 6 inches, though full wound rerolls against such a unit on an objective marker. Overall not awful if you want to add a little bit more anti-infantry clearance, though I do feel that's something that Orks do quite well. Next up we've got the Flash Gits, which have the sort of knob profile at toughness 5, 2 wounds and a 4+ save. They shoot with snaz guns with 3 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, or with heavy and sustained hits, so their firepower can get pretty nasty if they're stationary. On top of that, if they shoot at the closest thing, their attacks characteristic goes up to 4 for even more shots, and once per game they can trigger their ammo runt, lethal hits on a roll of a 6. Pretty nice for sustained plus lethal hits here. Perhaps their weaknesses are they won't be that great against high save things, given that they're only AP 1, and I feel like the loss of Captain Badrock was a pretty major blow to these guys. He really took them from being a unit that was just sort of okay and a bit middling to something that was genuinely scary and often in competitive lists. Unless they get a fairly major points cut without him, I'm just not sure that they're going to be worth it. Knobs were previously 110 points per 5, fighty greenskins with the same profile. In general, it was most common to see them run with Power Claws, 3 attacks hitting on a 4+ at Strength 9, AP 2, Damage 2, much scarier with 4 and Strength 10 in the Waaagh. They did get one change to their datasheet in their -1 to wound rule. It now only works when they're attacked by something that's higher than their toughness, so Strength 6 or above attacks against them. That's not really the end of the world, I don't think, but it does mean that the unit's going to be far easier to kill for things that are Strength 4 or below. Previously they would have been wounding them on a 6. They're still a pretty interesting unit though, certainly in Bully Boys with all of the double Waaagh things that can bring. Plus could be fun in Kult of Speed maybe for units to get the assault ramp rule and jump out of a battle wagon or truck perhaps. Next up we've got the up armored orcs in Mega Armor. These were 30 points each pre-Codex, and interestingly due to the ability to build the Big Mek within the unit, you could take anywhere between 2 or 6 of them, any number besides specifically 4. Their stat line is the same as it was, toughness 6 and 3 wounds with a 2+ save, though no invulnerable save. Means that they're really quite tanky, though high AP things will cause them to melt, and have some flexible war gear between Power Claws, Kill Saws, or Twin Kill Saws, depending on how much you want to spec into being able to take down tough tanks. Their datasheet did get an interesting change. Previously they got devastating wounds in the Waaagh, which I thought was okay. I guess it helped out against things like invulnerable saves, but in all honesty I think that they've got a better one now. They've swapped their special rule for a 4+ feel no pain in the Waaagh, just making these guys obscenely hard to take down in the turn of maximal carnage. A 4+ feel no pain is really going to make a whole load of damage go away, and as mentioned earlier, it feels pretty nasty to have these in Bully Boys. You could have 2 turns of multiple units of Mega Knobs all being incredibly hard to kill, maybe led by leaders like Big Meks for invulnerable saves, and perhaps even using their Armour of Contempt stratagem versus shooting. Next up for the Orky mounted units we've got the Warbikers. These guys were 70 points per 3 pre-Codex, maybe being used in competitive lists just a little bit more than they were previously, and it seems they're basically entirely unchanged in the Codex besides gaining the Speed Freaks keyword, and they will be a pretty central unit for Speed Mob I guess. They're fairly tanky with 3 wounds at toughness 6 and a 4+ save with the 6+ invulnerable. They get a twin big shooter worth of firepower but with shorter range. If they can get within 9 inches it gets quite good, 5 shots per bike, and they get AP -1 at that range, so quite good at clearing out hordes. They could do some pretty fearsome shooting with those sustained or lethal hit stratagem in Kult of Speed, which really does look like it synergizes pretty well with their desired range to be in. Next up for their equivalent flyboys we have the Deffkoptas, 100 points per 3 pre-Codex, and you can take either 3 or 6 of them. They're also unchanged and gain the Speed Freaks keyword as well. Compared with the Warbikes, they're a little bit tougher with 4 wounds rather than 3 and get a 12-inch move. They get to deep strike innately and get the fly keyword to move over enemy units, and their ability Death from Above means that if they move over an enemy unit, then they might hand out a few mortal wounds. Their damage is kind of interesting in fairly general purpose copter rockets that get D3 twin linked shots, still very inaccurate hitting on a 5+, but fairly potent if they land, and then some anti-horde melee with their spinning blades, 18 attacks for a unit of 3 of them, all at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1, good for killing hordes but not much more. There are vehicle keyword units as well. They usually can't fire their copter rockets within close combat due to them being blast. Again, probably most likely to be useful in Kult of Speed as opposed to anywhere else, I think. They do have some good stratagems to amp up their damage output there. Finally, for the mounted units, we have the Beast Snaggers in the Squighog Boys. Previously, they were 125 points per 3. Now they come in units of 4, given that the Smasher Squig has been rolled into the unit, and seeing as he has got at least a fairly chunky profile, I guess there'd probably be at least 170 points, maybe even a bit more. The regular Squigs are fairly chunky, at toughness 7, 3 wounds, and a big 5+ feel no pain. The Smasher Squig has got a profile that's better than them, but not quite as good as his character equivalent datasheets. He's got 4 wounds and 4 attacks with his big chopper. Looks like for some reason the big chopper's listed at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, when most of the rest are strength 7. It still gets the anti-vehicle and monster keywords though. Despite being a bigger unit, you can still double them up, so you can have a massive unit of 8 of them, and you can have the Squigosaur Warboss leading them now, so you could have 9 fairly ferocious squigs with general purpose damage out there. They should have enough volume of attacks to strip some wounds even off really tough stuff. They might just struggle with things with extremes of AP due to only AP 1. They do seem pretty intimidating though, and could be good in a number of different detachments. The standard War Horde is good. They've got some nice support from the Beast Snagger one with the scout moves or the -1 to wounds, and could even be interesting enough in Bully Boys, given that they'd have the War Boss keyword, means that you could have 2 turns worth of Waaagh for them, and that does seem really quite good, even if they're not getting any stratagem support. They also get bomb squigs in the unit, which is fun and ignore modifiers. They do have quite a bit going on. Getting into vehicle units, and I thought we'd start out with the Mek guns, 55 points each for a little bit of Mek artillery. It looks like a few damage profiles on the weapons did get side grades here, plus their special rule was changed. Previously it was kind of a badly balanced data state for unit profiles. The custom Mega Cannon was clearly the best. It does look like that one's been nerfed now though. It's only got AP -1 despite being a custom Mega Cannon weapon that basically feels like it's a big version of the ones that are strength 9 and AP 2. This one's been nerfed down to AP -1, but it's still at least fairly potent with D6 shots at strength 12, AP 1 and damage D6. For improvements, the Smasher gun has been improved a bit. Previously it was just D3 attacks and now it's D3+1, all at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3, so perhaps a bit better at destroying elite infantry versus the Mega Cannon now. Otherwise they gained the Grots keyword, which means they get the benefits from the Dread mob. They're going to be stronger there compared with anywhere else, and the special rule was changed to be a benefit of reroll 1s to hit against units at starting strength, but it doesn't work against monsters and vehicles. That's a slight tweak on the previous one, where they'd get reroll 1s to hit against units of 10 or more. I'd say this one's maybe a little bit more useful, though there's not much in it. Overall, after those changes, I feel like the gun profiles are a lot more balanced than they used to be. I'd hope that potentially it might be able to come with the unit getting a points cut though, if it's had its best profile nerfed. I feel like the 55 points was kind of representative of the custom Mega Cannon as opposed to the rest. Next up, let's take a look at the various October buggies. Broadly speaking, these have minimal changes but gained the Speed Freaks keyword, and they feel like they're going to be kind of good in Kult of Speed with the advance and shoot, fall back and shoot, and all the stratagem options, but probably going to remain pretty bad elsewhere. Unless Games Workshop slash the cost significantly, just for raw damage for their points they don't really have all that much. The buggies have toughness 7, 9 wounds and a 4+ save with a 6+ invulnerable. The Boomdacker Snazwagon is the one with the Mek special that spams out lots of strength 5 and damage 1 attacks and gets a -1 to hit debuff for enemies nearby, though this was altered to not work on monsters or vehicles for some reason, so not quite as useful as it was. The custom Booster Blaster still many strikes with that Rivet Cannon. That one is either 6 or 9 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2, so sort of looter death gun sort of style, plus a few burner shots up close. Could be alright to hand out the -1 to hit rule that it has with Riveting Dagger. I did notice that they added the grenade keyword to this as well, just given that the Ork who fires the Rivet Cannon is holding one. In general, maybe not the most exciting damage profile though. It's good against some things, but very, very bad against a lot of things. The Rocket Truck Squig Buggy is 100 points pre-Codex. It's got the indirect fire squig launchers with D6 plus 6 shots at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2. Though unfortunately they won't be anywhere near as good at indirect fire. They could get a +1 to hit for targeting infantry before, but that special rule has now been changed to a -2 to move, advance and charge on a 4+. Feels like overall that's probably a downgrade. It means that it's just not going to do any meaningful damage out of line of sight now. And while that movement debuff is good, only being able to trigger it 50% of the time it means that it's nowhere near as reliable. Overall, I'd say it's not particularly good news for it. It does come with that Squig Mine as well, which gives you the chance for some mortal wounds up close. Could be kind of big, but could always let you down again on a roll of a 4+. The Shock Jump Dragster is the one that gets the single big precision shot at strength 8, AP 2 and damage d6 plus 1, could maybe worry some enemy characters, plus it also gets a rocket launcher. Its Shock Tunnel special rule means that when it makes an advance, it gets to teleport elsewhere on the board, which could be helpful enough for jumping around to do certain secondary objectives, or just maybe annoying the enemy with nuisance charges in the turn of the Waaagh even. This one, maybe even more than the rest, feels super good in Speed Mob now. It means that you get to use that shock tunnel every turn and still get to shoot, as you can shoot after you've advanced. You could have a trio of these warping around the board and putting their firepower where it's most needed, maybe in some sort of weird race car assassin squad. Finally, we've got the Matrax Scrapjet. This one's 80 points, and in all honesty, I think it's a bit more threat than most of the rest. It gets 2 twin-linked big shooters, some wing missiles and a rocket cannon for a bunch of strength 9 and damage 3 attacks, and then when it charges in, it gets some mortal wounds with its drill through special rule, and a very slightly boosted melee profile with its nose drill. At 80 points, it feels like it's a bit more threat than some of them. Maybe it feels like one of the ones that's best at home on the front line in the Cult of Speed, perhaps. Overall, maybe a bit of a shame that they didn't get just a bit more raw threat increase. I feel like these are the sort of models that might have been nice to see just get a fair bit more dangerous, even if they had to go up in points a bit as a counterpoint. Just feels like overall you're going to be underwhelmed by them in a big way, unless you're literally using the Cult of Speed. Onto the Orky Walkers next, and all of these are going to be pretty interesting with the fairly rampant damage boost that they can get with Dread Mob, even if they might have to take a few hazardous checks. Killer cans were previously 125 per 3 pre-Codex, 5 wound little walkers with toughness 6, a little bit slow and a little bit cowardly with their leadership 8 due to being piloted by Grots. They get 3 attacks each in close combat at strength 8 and damage 3, and then the choice of 4 different ranged weapons. Probably the rockets might be one of the most interesting. They did improve the Grot Zuka in this one, now getting D3 plus 3 shots, all with strength 6, AP minus 1 and ignoring cover. The new bits are the extra AP and the ignoring cover, which really do account for a lot of threat given how easy it is to get a cover save in current 40k. They also get the slightly weird option of getting a big shooter with devastating wounds as well, called a can shooter. I feel like with the options though, you're probably going to be better off either with the Grot Zuka or the rockets. Otherwise, besides being able to access the big Dread Mob damage buffs, they got an interesting special rule now. Shooty Power Trip says that when you're shooting, you can roll 1d6. On a 1 or 2, the unit takes d6 mortal wounds, which is kind of bad. On a 3 or 4, you get plus 1 strength to your ranged weapons, and on a 5 or 6, you get plus 1 attack to your ranged weapons. I must admit, it doesn't really feel like a very appealing special rule with a chance to deal d6 mortal wounds to yourself. Plus 1 strength, even if it does make the difference of a plus 1 to wound, isn't all that big a deal, and plus 1 attack for ranged weapons again is sort of okay, but not really stand out versus the risk of taking d6 mortal wounds on your own squad. By the way it's phrased, it sounds like it says that you can roll the d6, doesn't say that you have to. And in all honesty, probably the boring answer is that a lot of the time it's just going to be best not to. Just feels like that's a rule that's going to do more damage to your own units than you on average, unless you need literally every iota of damage output or the game's going to be lost. Next up, we've got the Ork Dreadnought in the Death Dread, 130 points pre-Codex, a chunky toughness 9 walker with a 2+ save, an 8-inch move, and basically 4 hard points for weapons or claws. You may as well take at least 1 Dread Claw, as it gives you 4 attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3. And then for the rest of the weapons, you can either choose between ranged weapons from the standard Orky ones, including things like custom Mega Blasters, or taking additional close combat weapons, which could put your walker up to 8 attacks in the Waaagh potentially. The buff that the Death Dread had was that its Dread Claw is now a strength 12 rather than strength 10, so a lot better at destroying enemy heavies. Feels like it's a unit that might well enjoy the Dread Mob benefits. If you're going with a shooty Death Dread, then you probably just want to roll randomly rather than taking 4 hazardous checks. But maybe just 1 hazardous check to choose your favourite buff for melee could be kind of nice on those Dread Claws, which is a profile that's worth buffing. Then for the biggest Ork Walkers, we've got the Gorkanaut, Morkanaut and Stomper. The Gorkanaut was 280 points pre-Codex, the Naughts being toughness 12, 20 wounds with a 3+ save. The Gorkanaut gets a 6+ invulnerable, and the Morkanaut gets a 5+. The Gorkanaut's the slightly more close combat themed one. This one gets some serious melee with 5 attacks at strength 18, AP 3 and damage 6, or sweep profile if you're fighting infantry. And as well as getting a few rockets and big shooters and things, you get a big Death Storm mega shooter, 20 shots at 236-inch range, or a big 30 within 18, or at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1. Again, that could be a really nice profile for the Dread Mob buffs to make better. Otherwise, it's got a transport capacity of 12. It can move over small bits of terrain quite comfortably, and it has a special rule for +1 to hit in the Waaagh, just in case you wanted that melee profile to be even scarier. As ever, it looks massively scarier in Dread Mob than anywhere else. Those boosts really sound like it could help out a lot on both its range and its close combat. Otherwise, the Morkanaut is 295 points pre-Codex. Like the Gorkanaut, it's completely unchanged, a similar sort of profile, but the better invulnerable save. This one is the more shooting-orientated one, so gets a slightly reduced melee profile, but to balance for that you get an enormous custom Mega Zapper, D6 plus 3 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage D6, with a +1 to hit in the turn that you call the Waaagh. Again, looks very nice with Dread Mob things to make it scarier. This thing is certainly be looking nicer with the 4 rerolls to hit stratagem on the go. And it's obviously still very scary in melee, has the potential for some very big tank shock there as well. Finally, we've got the really big Ork Walker that's worth more points than the other two put together. The Stomper is the enormous effigy of Gork and it is unchanged in the Codex. It fires out with 3 really quite major big gun profiles, super rockets, a super gatler and a death cannon, all hitting on the very Orky 5+ though, which isn't that reliable. And then its profile in close combat is kind of hilarious, massive strength 24, AP 5 and damage 10. You don't really want to get in the way of that kind of mega chopper, even if you're a Demon Primarch or something. 800 points has generally been considered far too much for him. He does have a pretty crazy profile with 30 wounds at toughness 14 and a 2+ save, but given that that's almost half your army at 2000 points, its durability maybe it still doesn't stand out and could crumble against the wrong sort of very heavy anti-tank firepower. Admittedly though, in the new Codex, with the amount of buffs that you can layer on him with Dread Mob, you might have enough there to make him kind of worth it, and certainly feels like he could work pretty strongly in casual games, particularly if the opponent isn't doing very clever things on objectives or bringing enough big toys to bring him down reliably. Might be interesting to see just how much firepower we can get out of this guy in a follow-up video. Next up, let's take a look at the Orky transports, big and small. The truck's been a staple unit in 10th edition despite a few points increases. 65 points still seems pretty fine for what it does though. A toughness 8, 10 wound little transport with an open-topped firing deck, a wrecking ball to allow some perhaps surprisingly potent tank shock, and grot riggers to help put it together a bit once it gets too broken. It's pretty nice and cheap for a little battlefield bunker to charge your boys out of, and can be handy enough for some of the shooty variants as well, maybe moving around with some burner boys to get them to the midfield for some drive-by flaming. Could be pretty useful in just about any Orky force that's got some scary melee that you want to deliver to the front for cheap. The more premium option is the Battle Wagon, 160 points for a much tougher transport with a bigger hold, 16 wounds at either toughness 10 or toughness 12 if you take the hard case, really quite durable for the 160 points it was before. The Battle Wagon has taken a few changes. They seem to have tried to round out the top guns a little bit so the kill cannon isn't just spectacularly better than the rest. The kill cannon's got less shots now, so D6 plus 1 shots at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2. The zap gun's been buffed to being a single shot at strength D6 plus 6 and a big damage 5 with the anti-vehicle 4+ keyword, and the cannon gained a pip of strength on the shell profile and a few extra shots on the frag. When that's all said and done though, I'm still not convinced that they're particularly massively threatening given hitting on the 5+. The other change was that their firing deck was reduced a bit. It's down to firing deck 11 when previously everything could fire out at firing deck 22, so maybe not quite as godly of a shooting bunker if you wanted one for it there. Otherwise though, it's still got a very big transport capacity. You can fit 22 models in it, so you could have a Boyz unit with 2 attached characters or some maxed out mega knobs and can still transport Ghazghkull. It still appears that they haven't quite fixed the issue with him though. He takes up 18 spaces. If you have Makari, that's 19, so you can't quite fit a minimum Mega Knob bodyguard in there with him. I did feel that that was one that they were hopefully going to fix in this book. Otherwise, it does have some threat in close combat as well. Gets a Death Roller, Wrecking Ball, and Grabbing Claw for a little bit of melee threat. Overall, I don't feel it's a too bad deal. Fairly tanky, at least a little bit of threat between range and melee, and gets a whole load of boys stuck into close combat. Otherwise, there's the Beast Snagger equivalent of the Battle Wagon, the Hunter Rig and Kill Rig. The Kill Rig was 170 points pre-Codex and a similar sort of stat line. maybe a little bit tankier than the Battle Wagon minus the hard case. It gets a 6+ feel no pain. The Kill Rig's a big centerpiece model that's got quite a lot going on. It's got a heavy lobber for some indirect, a sticker cannon that's got the snagged special rule that gives you a +2 to charge the unit that you tagged, and that was improved to deny overwatch against the bearer for some reason. I guess not unhelpful, but at the same time I don't feel like the Kill Rig was routinely getting overwatched to death, so I'm not sure that's the biggest deal really. In melee it also gets a whole variation of profiles, with saw blades, savage horns and hooves, plus some butcher boys. It has a transport capacity of 11. Unfortunately, having lost its firing deck altogether, it looks like it's only the Hunter rig that has that now. And otherwise its selling point versus the Hunter rig is the Whir Tower, really quite a punchy anti-tank weapon with an interesting Torrent D3 profile at strength 12 AP3 and damage D6. Not bad for a bit of overwatch there potentially. And a melee buff for nearby beast snaggers, giving you +1 strength or maybe lethal hits if you get lucky. Overall interesting enough as a generally dangerous centerpiece model. Really not awful if the unit that you want to get to the front is Beast Snagger Boys, maybe with a Beast Boss. Could be interesting in Da Big Hunt. Otherwise its counterpart without the Whir Tower is the Hunter rig. This one's 150 points pre-Codex, so it's basically 20 points cheaper but lacked the Whir Tower, which I think was a kind of big deal given of how much threat it was. This one has much more transport capacity of 21 and retains a firing deck even if it was reduced down to 11. It also had its special rule moved around a little bit. Previously, it was very safe disembarking if the model blew up while you had a squad embarked. Now it's been changed that if you're in combat with some units inside it, then you get +1 attack to the butcher boys it fights with. You get 1 extra attack per occupant to a maximum of an extra +6 attacks, so a little bit more volume anti-horde there. Realistically though, if you want to actually deal melee damage with the Beast Snagger Boys, they're going to do far more outside of the rig rather than in it. Overall, unless they get a bigger points disparity, I feel like the Kill Rig's going to remain the one to go for. Orky Plains next, and there weren't really many changes here. They remain the same general profile at toughness 9, 12 wounds and a 3+ save. They did get the Speed Freaks keyword though, so it does mean they could actually use some genuinely fairly dangerous stratagems out of the Kult of Speed detachment, though it might be a little bit clunky to line them up. The Waaagh bomb is by far the most expensive and gets the best shooting. It gets either teleport blasters or more likely the twin mega cannons plus a smasher gun, and rerolls hit rolls of 1 against things that don't fly. It also gets a 4+ force shield save as well, which is nice. Maybe feels like it could be halfway to okay if you zoomed it in turn 2 in Kult of Speed and used some stratagems on it. If it could survive a turn and then get within 9 inches of something, you could actually use one of the very scary stratagems for some big sustained hits maybe. The Ork bombers look like they're going to remain garbage. They're just not going to be good while Games Workshop keeps aircraft rules the way they are. The burner bomber swoops in and fires with a few damage 1 attacks that Orks don't generally tend to struggle with too much, won't be able to drop its bombs until turn 3 earliest, and even when it does that, the damage output is really low. It can strip cover from a unit, but it's just not really enough. The Blitzer bomber isn't much different either, a few damage 1 attacks, and the bomb is kind of underwhelming, just a 4+ chance to deal d6 mortal wounds if it even lives enough to drop it. Otherwise, the Dakka Jet is maybe a bit more positive, as it actually gets to inflict its full damage on the turn that it comes in. This one does actually stack some meaningful damage 1 saves on the foe. 18 shots if it comes on within 18 inches of the thing that it attacks, and it'll average 12 hits on its targets, given that all of its hits count as critical, so you get the sustained hits on everything. Could be fairly fun to use the Speed Freak stratagem for sustained hits too if it could get within 9 inches. If you did want more anti-infantry firepower, it's maybe not the worst, but again I feel like the Orky melee units tend to make short work of infantry. It's more big tough stuff that they struggle with. Finally, for vehicle style units before we get onto characters, we've got the Big Ed Boss Bunker. This one was way overcosted in the index, 135 points for a 12 wound toughness 10 fortification. It does have a bit of firepower with some big shooters plus the Gaze of Gork, a kind of inaccurate big attack that can strike lucky with sustained hits D3, and mainly seems to be used as a shooting deck unit for an Ork firepower unit, though still isn't really ideal for a lot of things like flash gits or looters, given that they can't use their unit special rule while embarked. Having that plus not being able to contest objectives or anything like that just means it's not really very good. I feel like it would have to be very cheap indeed if it was going to be genuinely useful. Lastly, let's get onto the Ork characters, and we'll start out with the standard War Boss, a fairly staple unit in competitive lists. He was really cheap before at 65 points, a 6 wound toughness 5 Ork with a 5+ invulnerable save, striking in melee usually with a power claw at strength 10 and damage 2, plus some attack squig attacks. He gives his unit a +1 to hit, and in the Waaagh he gets an extra 4 attacks, which is a massive boost to his melee power. Overall, he's going to remain pretty great value if he's around about the 65-point mark still. There's plenty of interesting things that can give him some good enhancements, and he's really relevant for a whole load of the detachments, everything from Waaagh Tribe to Bully Boys, or leading boys around in the Green Tide. The Warboss in Mega Armor comes with a huge chopper. He's 80 points and significantly tankier, 7 wounds, toughness 6, and a 2+ armor save is kind of big. Plus that chopper gets a big strength 12, so can hopefully chop up some tanks a little bit better than some. He'll give the Mega Knobs he can lead a +1 to hit, and he got his rule changed around. Previously he was the one that had the 4+ feel no pain in the Waaagh. That one was swapped to the Mega Knobs, which I think is overall a lot better and more relevant. He has now gained a damage buff in the Waaagh, getting that huge chopper to damage 3. Really quite nice in the turn that he's getting an extra attack. That makes him a pretty legitimate threat to tanks. Seems like he'll be a pretty fun option to lead units of Mega Knobs in the Bully Boys formation, where it looks like they're going to be a key unit with their 2 turns of Feel No Pain. You'd be weighing up him versus the Big Mek with the custom force field plus the repairs and things. I feel like both have their merits. I might slightly prefer the Big Mek myself on first take before we know the points. For the Beast Snagger war bosses, we have the Beast Boss and the one on the Squigosaur. The standard Beast Boss is 100 points and has a fairly similar profile to the much cheaper War Boss. He gets the choice between either his Snagger Claw or his Beast Chopper for a bit of variation in melee. He gets a 6+ Feel No Pain built in, and his big thing is that he gets anti-vehicle and anti-monster, and also devastating wounds on the charge, so that means that when he's swinging with a whole load of attacks, there's going to be a lot of his hits that just go straight through enemy armor. Overall, he's pretty scary and a legitimate threat against enemy tanks and vehicles. His only change in the Codex was +1 to his wounds to bring him to 6, which puts him in line with the standard war boss. Overall seems good. He'll be big in that big hunt detachment, particularly getting the extra 1 damage enhancement in that seems kind of fun. He'll still be solid in Waaagh Tribe, maybe jumping out of either trucks, battle wagons or kill rigs, or maybe even Bully Boys given that he does have the war boss keyword for extra turns worth of Waaagh. For perhaps one of the most changed orcs since the Index is the Beast Boss on Squigosaur. Previously these guys operated more as independent monsters, just wandering around tanking loads of damage and hitting things with choppers. Now that they're going to be leader units to the Squighog boys, now you can't lead them with Smasher Squigs anymore. As mentioned, potentially a very scary unit of 9 big squigs there. Pretty indomitable to have all those tough critters coming your way. As a result, and maybe kind of expectedly, his durability was reduced. He's now just toughness 8, 8 wounds and a 5+ feel no pain. He used to be toughness 10, 9 wounds and a 4+. Does maybe stand to reason though, given that he'll be safe behind a unit. Otherwise though, he did take a fair few other changes. He no longer has Deadly Demise 1, so no chance to send that squig rampant or whatever when he dies. He swapped his aura of reroll charges for just a +1 to charge for his own unit, which could be interesting enough if he ever came out of strategic reserve potentially. Just generally good to increase his threat range though, I guess. His heroic intervention rule used to be 1 CP to get that rather than 2, now it's just 3. That's fairly powerful in that you could now position him and his massive units to genuinely jump into close combat and be a massive melee threat, as most things just aren't going to want to be in combat with that kind of unit. And he has had his keywords changed a fair bit. He's gained War Boss and Mounted. He's no longer a monster. His unit's still going to be very tanky though. He'll be quite nice with the -1 to wound stratagem from the War Horde or the -1 to wound enhancement in the Big Hunt. He hits with a whole flurry of attacks with the anti-keywords and devastating wounds on the Squigosaur's jaws, and feels like the big unit will be interesting if it's costed right. Definitely feels like the definition of a unit that the opponent could lose a lot of firepower trying to take down, and it's so big and threatening that they can't afford to just let it charge the core of their army, otherwise they're going to have big problems. Finally, for the generic bosses, we've got the Deffkiller Wartrike, the speed boss. He was 80 points pre-Codex and has a somewhat similar profile to the Buggies, but -1 toughness, though gaining a 5+ invulnerable save like the war bosses. It's broadly similar to how he was, gaining the Speed Freak keyword and just having his high octane fuel ability renamed to Fuel Mixer Grot. He can lead Warbikers where he gives them a +1 to hit in melee only, plus contributes his own shooting with his killer jets and Snagger Claw with a strength 10 power claw in combat. He also gives them an automatic 6-inch advance as well, which often isn't too useful unless you're in the turn of the Waaagh, as it does compromise their shooting. That feels like it's an ability that goes very well with Cult of Speed though, being able to advance that far and still shoot, maybe even charge if you're on the turn of the Waaagh still. Can still be unusually tanky in things like Horde with the 4+ feel no pain, that's a lot of wounds to basically get double durability on. Next up, let's talk about the Meks. We've already talked about the new Big Mek at the start, so here's the one with Mega Armor. He was 85 points pre-Codex, and basically seems to be a defense specialist and medic for the Mega Nobs more or less. The only thing that actually changed in the Codex was that he gained the actual Mek keyword, so it will confer all the buffs of Dread Mob to a Mega Nobs unit, which does feel interesting at least on paper. Hitting on 4s, they should still be able to trigger a fair amount of those fun damage buffs in close combat. He gets the choice of either a claw or saw for his melee weapons, so he does contribute a bit there, and then he does a bunch of things for the unit, rerolling 1s to hit at range, which is a bit okay. He can get a custom Mega Blaster himself. More importantly though, he can have a custom force field for a 4+ invulnerable save for the unit. Generally that's going to be better than a teleport blaster, I think. Means the unit can be spectacularly tanky in terms of the Waaagh with a 4+ feel no pain as well as that. And then when the opponents no doubt tried and failed to destroy the unit in their turn, he can patch up some armor and restore 1 to the board each command phase, plus once per game his Grot Oiler can regenerate D3 lost wounds on 1 bodyguard. Overall, I feel like he's a very solid addition to Mega Nobs, making them far tougher and regenerate, plus adding a little bit of his own threat too. Feels kind of standout for Bully Boys and could be interesting enough in Dread Mob in a transport perhaps. Next we've got the Big Mek with Shock Attack Gun. 75 points for a mech with a great big snotling cannon. It's heavy, so if he's stationary he gets d6 plus 1 shots, hitting on a 4+ at strength 9, AP 4 and damage d6. At least a fairly threatening profile against enemy sort of mid-toughness targets. He gives his unit reroll hit rolls of 1, which could be meaningful for the looters or maybe mech guns. His Grot Assistant allows you to reroll the number of shots that the shock attack gun gets once per game, and being hit by a bunch of deranged snotlings makes the enemy have to take a battle shock test, though it's a little bit meaningless most of the time in your own turn. Generally he wasn't considered particularly interesting for his raw damage pre-Codex. Again, it looks like he's going to be one that's really driven by the Dread Mob. He can give the mech keyword to looters, or could be a way to get enhancements like ignores cover to looters or mech guns. Plus his own reroll 1s to hit don't hurt, and between the detachment rule and the stratagems you could have a fairly intimidating shooting unit. The only change that he had in the Codex was that he can now lead nobs as well, though they seem like a pretty bad fit for him. I guess if you wanted to lead them to give them the mech keyword, you might be better off with the standard mech, the one with the threat in combat. Finally for the mechs we have the mini mech. He's 45 points for 4 wound mech with a 5+ save. He gets a custom Mega Slugger and a kill saw attack in close combat. Very little threat in his own right, but he's mainly there to help out nearby vehicles. If he's next to a vehicle, he counts as a lone operative if he doesn't want to lead one of the units, and then can hand one vehicle a +1 to hit, which again feels like it might well come into its own in Dread Mob, particularly if you shell out for one of the Titanics, maybe the Gorkanaut, Morkanaut, or even the Stomper. It'd be interesting to see if they can be made threatening enough if they get +1 to hit, the good stratagems, and the good innate damage boost out of Dread Mob. Plus he can also heal them, maybe even give his keywords to one of the other units for a bit more firepower if relevant. Next we've got the Orky Psykers. The weird boy was 55 points pre-Codex, a 4 wound toughness 5 character with a sniper attack and a jump mechanic. Headbanger is a sniper attack that gets far better if he's in a big mob. For every 5 models in the mob you get +1 strength and +1 damage to the attack. So if he was jumping around with a full mob of 20, he could be hitting with a 5 damage attack at strength 10, only still ballistic skill 4+ though, so even if he does get to attack his target, he might just miss. Really though, his biggest ability is being able to use that jump. If he can avoid rolling a 1 and taking d6 mortal wounds, a unit of Boyz can be teleported across the board, landing somewhere that's 9 inches away from the enemy, and then maybe trying to charge them, perhaps with one of the stratagems that makes charge distance shorter. There's one in Green Tide and one in Warhorde. Green Tide on paper doesn't feel like the worst place for him. Some of the main issues with Hordes is getting them to the places that they need to be, and he can do that in style. Plus he would get a more savage headbanger attack if he's in a full mob like they like to run, and that shortening charge detachment does work out quite well with him. Could be a big power move to have a weird boy jump either turn 2 or turn 3 for a +2 or a +3 inch to the charge. Otherwise I still think that he pretty much eclipses the Beast Snagger Boy. He's 60 points pre-Codex, and he gets a sort of similar scaling damage attack in the Eyes of Mork. In a big mob of Beast Snaggers, he could be averaging around about 4 hits out of those at strength 8, AP -3 and damage 2. It's not awful, but not really worth the setup, otherwise he can debuff enemy morale for a -2 to a leadership test. Overall, he just feels unlikely to make the cut versus the other Beast Snagger characters. Might have been one that they could have done a bit of rewriting of the datasheet, I feel. The only change that he did have was they gave his leadership ability a name. It confers the technical states known as being confrazzled, and that does actually have in-game relevance as it means that you can't stack it multiple times, not that it would really be worth doing so, I feel. Painboyz next, and for the Beast Snagger one we've got the Painboss. He's unchanged in the Codex, being the Painboy medic. He gets a 5+ feel no pain and confers the same to his Beast Snagger boys, maybe a little bit less of a boost for them compared with the other Orks, given that they already get a 6+1 at base. Otherwise he gets a Beast Snagger Claw with anti-keywords on a regular Power Claw style profile, and he gets the ability to heal a Beast Snagger character for 3 lost wounds, and a once per game ability to revive some dead bodyguard units. The healing wounds could previously be actually okay on something like a Squigosaur boss running solo, though I feel like now they're tucked away in the heart of a unit, it's not going to be quite as relevant. In general, again, I feel like if you want a character to lead Beast Snagger boys, it's probably going to be the standard Beast boss. I guess this guy could be an alternative if you can't afford the points. Otherwise, the more standard Painboy is 70 points. He's unchanged in the Codex, though I feel like he is going to be more relevant for trying to make the Green Tide yet more tanky. Big 20 strong blocks of boys weren't quite as popular in the previous index, and now there's at least a detachment that just wants to build around them. He feels like he's going to have a home there. He can lead either boys, knobs, looters, burner boys, or tank busters. Realistically though, it's only going to make sense for boys or knobs, and probably the boys, given that the knobs only get their special rule if they're led by a war boss. 5+ feel no pain does help with the boys' durability against damage 1 weapons, maybe something that their detachment rule isn't going to help them with quite as much. Adds another power claw into the unit, has the once per game Grot Orderly to allow you to resurrect D3 bodyguard units in one command phase once per battle, and finally also has an Urti Syringe as well, which is fun. Anti-infantry, extra attacks and precision, and if you do manage to score a critical wound with that thing, as you would if you trigger the anti-keyword, the enemy gets D6 mortal wounds, which is genuinely very punchy against infantry. The Adeptus Custodes will be wishing they had their Aegis back. Overall not too bad, it's kind of reliant on 20 strong boys mobs being genuinely good. I feel like he's at least a datasheet worth considering in Green Tide. Finally we get on to the Orky named characters, of which there are 4 now. Unfortunately, after the losses of Grotsnik, Zagstruck, and Captain Badrug, they're rather thin on the ground. It was maybe kind of a shame that we didn't get a new unit profile for the Bad Moon boss from the Big Dakka. Off-Tac Black Hawk was kind of fun. The Space Marines did get a unit profile for Uriel Ventris after all. Starting out with the big boss himself though, Ghazghkull Thraka was 235 points pre-Codex, and his datasheets got 2 major improvements. He still leads Meganobs and is very big and tanky, 10 wounds at toughness 6 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and accompanied by Makari, who gets his suspiciously lucky 2+ invulnerable save that could either tank loads of damage or fall flat immediately. His damage was already at least fairly scary, with a whole bunch of Mork's raw volume fire shots, fairly inaccurate there. He mainly got the job done in melee with Gork's Claw, 6 attacks at strength 14 and damage 4, which is pretty scary against most things, though this has also now gained a sweep profile as well, 12 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, so he's going to be massively more threatening against things like standard Space Marines. On top of that, his Prophet of the Great Waaagh ability was increased. He already got +1 to hit and wound for his Mega Nob charges, which made them even more threatening, and certainly helps out with his own melee profile as well, which is already admittedly pretty nasty. Besides that, he gains the Warboss keyword, I guess relevant for the Bully Boys, and Makari still gets his ability where he gets an aura of lethal hit, pretty good on anything that gets bonuses to critical hits, at least for the turn when the Waaagh is called. Overall I felt like he was already at least kind of usable, maybe not super standout competitive, but it seems that rules wise he's only got better from this update. Otherwise, and his miniature release last year, we've got Boss Snickrot, 85 points for the super sneaky stabby orc. He actually got a pretty big and interesting change, gaining lone operative if he's not leading commandos. The thought of that had occurred to me before actually. I did feel like it was weird that orcs didn't have access to any lone operatives, and Boss Snickrot fighting alone like Kayvan Shrike of the Raven Guard would make sense. Otherwise he gains the smoke keyword but doesn't have the war boss keyword for bully boys or anything like that. He is just a regular boss, not a war boss. Otherwise he's got a somewhat anti-infantry close combat profile. Mork's teeth hit with a whole bunch of strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 attacks twin linked with precision. He gets stealth alongside his commandos and can give them the benefit of cover if they didn't already have it. And his Cunning Infiltrator special rule means that you can have a once per game redeployment. Really quite a big move that one, and could be used to do secondary objectives and things, perhaps particularly if he's acting as a lone operative. It's kind of interesting that you can use Snickrot now just as the cheapest infiltrate unit that Orks can get, and I feel like he could genuinely be quite an interesting addition to an Orky army. Give you an option to start in the midboard and an annoying lone operative that are just generally hard to deal with in the first place, and at a far cheaper cost than a full unit of commandos would be. For the Outcast Alpha Runt Herd, we've got Zogrod Wartstagger with his big hair. He was 80 points pre-Codex, and the only major change that he got for his profile was his pistol got the name Squig Stopper. Still basically just an amped up slugger, but it gained AP 1 and the anti-monster keyword weirdly enough. Otherwise he hits with a bunch of strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks in close combat. He essentially seems to have nicked a Custodes Guardian Spear which has the exact same profile. He's got a 6+ Feel No Pain, and he leads Gretchen, which he enhances to be super runts. They scout forward 9 inches. Each time they make an attack, they get to add +1 to hit and wound. Enemy units are -1 to wound them, and they also get a bonus 6-inch move during the Waaagh. They're still Gretchen, but Gretchen are very cheap. You could have him plus them for 160 points. That's just a whole bunch of annoying chaff in the midfield, plus he can actually lend a hand in close combat himself with a little bit of somewhat quality melee. Finally, we have the big guy on the Great White Squig in Mozrog Scragbaz. He's the unique character version of the beast boss on Squigosaur, and as mentioned there were lots of changes to that datasheet. He leads Squighog boys rather than goes independently. His durability was similarly reduced to toughness 8, 8 wounds and a 5+ feel no pain, no longer gets deadly demise, and he got similar keyword changes, gaining war boss unmounted and losing the monster keyword. As before, he's slightly tougher than the standard beast boss. He gets a 4+ invulnerable save rather than a 5+, and he's slightly more dangerous in close combat as well. He gets damage 3 and 4 rather than damage 2 and 3, gets a little bit more strength as well. Though unfortunately Big Chomper's jaws aren't quite as threatening as they were. They used to have a devastating wounds on a 5+ when he charged in, now it's still just a 6 unfortunately. He still gets a special rule where he gets extra damage against vehicles, but now he confers a special rule where his lead units models get to fight in death on a 4+ if they happen to be slain in melee. To be fair, that's not an awful special rule, though I feel like maybe they're a little bit more likely to get shot down at range, given that enemies probably wouldn't want to be tangling with them head on if he is leading a big unit. Still though, generally looks pretty threatening, loads of damage on his attacks and even more so against monsters and vehicles. His main issue has generally been that he's got low AP. I guess the big hunt could help out with that a bit if you mark his charge target as the prey. Overall though, I think as 10th edition codexes go, the Orks have had one of the better ones so far at first impressions. Genuinely quite different detachments that really build around the most iconic themes of the army, do genuinely add some interesting rules to each one of those, so the focused units will be better in that detachment versus elsewhere. Even though, as mentioned before, I do feel like some of them have a bit more chance of being competitive than others. I feel like the Waaagh Horde, Bully Boys, and maybe the Dread Mob, depending on the points cost of the walkers, they might be the ones to look at first. I feel like all three of the others, though, are still at least interesting. Kult of Speed does make the Speed Freaks a lot better, plus it gets that Assault Ramp Mega Charge unit, which is scary. Green Tide could be a bit of a spoiler list against enemies that just haven't brought enough guns to lay low 120 Orks with invulnerable saves, and the Big Hunt can have some interesting things with those really big units of Squighogs with beast bosses, scouting them or getting permanent -1 to wound. Always a shame about the lost data sheets, I'm sure that won't make some people happy. And I'm not really 100% sure the new Mek's going to be too much use in any sort of optimised list. Just feels like it perhaps needed a bit more of a meaningful leadership rule really. For datasheet changes, it's kind of hard to interpret them without any points cost that we know are coming at some stage. I'll hold off on making any sort of tier list or anything like that until we get them. Presuming things are staying somewhat similar though, maybe particularly interesting ones look like the Mega Knobs with their 4+ Feel No Pain in the Waaagh. I think Boss Snickrot is genuinely useful as an Orky lone operative with cheap infiltrate as well. I feel like he's going to see some play. Boys with sticky objectives is quite a big update. Feels like they might be just a little bit more auto-include to have at least some to mark objectives and make things difficult for your opponent. where I feel like a few units might really be struggling unless something good happens for them. Tank busters still have a pretty bad datasheet, as do flash gits without bad luck, and kind of a shame that the burner and blitzer bomber took no improvements whatsoever. In any case though, I feel like it's broadly a good codex. Obviously no real saying exactly where it's going to land competitively at this point without points cost, but I feel like there's enough here to give you some pretty interesting, fun and fluffy builds. I feel like all of these detachments look interesting enough to be pretty threatening at a more casual level, even if maybe some of them break through a lot more than others. Look forward to hearing your thoughts in any case. Feel free to let me know if I missed anything in terms of corrections down in the comments below. I'll try and put a pinned comment below if I miss anything really big. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Orks over the next week or so. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you want to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming as regularly as they do. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.